Hey there, tonight we're diving into a knight's Christmas during the Crusades. Not the fairy tale version you know, but one where roasted partridges might be swapped for stale bread, and the only carols are the sounds of clanking armor and distant battle horns. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now make yourself cozy, maybe adjust your room temperature or get that cup of tea, and let's explore tonight's tale together. For Night on the Road during the Crusades, December was less silent night and more screaming logistics. The medieval Christmas away from home wasn't filled with cozy hearths and merry caroling, but with the clatter of armor, the stench of overworked horses, and the relentless drain of coin. The Crusades were a medieval money pit, and any knight worth his salt knew that before he ever hefted a sword or swore an oath to reclaim the Holy Land, he had to tackle the Herculean task of packing. Let's start with the warhorse, a knight's trusty steed, and let's face it, his most valuable asset. A decent warhorse back in the day could set you back about 50 to 100 pounds of silver. For context, that's like dropping a small fortune on a luxury car today. But unlike a sleek Tesla, this beast required constant feeding, grooming, and care, which was no small feat when you were schlepping across the Levant. Forget about stable garages or horse gyms. It was all about finding enough forage to keep your equine investment from becoming dinner for the local wildlife. Now, as for that medieval packing list, prepare to be amused. Sure, you had your swords and shields, but let's not forget essentials like a portable altar for those impromptu battlefield masses, because nothing says peace on earth quite like a quick prayer before a bloody skirmish. You'd also need a selection of tunics, because even in the 12th century, knights were fashion conscious enough to want a fresh outfit after a day in the trenches. And oh, the cost of armor. A suit of chainmail could run you about £100, a king's ransom to ensure you weren't skewered on the first day out. Yet despite all these costs, the myth of the chivalrous knight has persisted through the ages, a noble figure riding gallantly into battle, resplendent in shining armor. But the truth, it was hardly romantic. In reality, camp life was more Bear Grylls survivalist than Arthurian legend. Knights dealt with lice, dysentery, and the constant threat of scurvy, hardly the stuff of epic poetry. And let's talk about food. Forget the Christmas feast with turkey and all the trimmings. Knights subsisted on whatever they could scrounge up or barter for, often relying on hardtack and salt-cured meats that could outlast the Crusades themselves. So when people talk about a Crusader's Christmas, it's not visions of sugar plums dancing in their heads, but rather the hope that their bread wouldn't break their teeth. So why did they do it? Why endure the hardship, the cost, and the discomfort? Well, the Crusades were wrapped in layers of religious fervor, promises of heavenly rewards, and let's be honest, the lure of earthly gains. Many knights were second or third sons, with no land to inherit, seeking fame and fortune in foreign lands. And while the church painted the Crusades as a holy mission, for these knights, it was often a combination of personal ambition and spiritual duty. But let's not get too cynical. The romantic notion of chivalry wasn't entirely a fabrication. It was an ideal that knights aspired to, a code that promised nobility, honor, and bravery. The reality, though, was a gritty, mud-streaked existence. The dichotomy between the legend and the lived experience is part of what makes this period so fascinating. In the end, a knight preparing for a Crusader Christmas was embarking on a journey that was both a test of faith and endurance. It was a time when the lines between myth and reality blurred, where the promise of redemption clashed with the stark realities of medieval warfare. It was a world where the spirit of adventure was tempered by the weight of chainmail and the jingle of coins slipping through their fingers. So, while we might dream of medieval knights as paragons of virtue, let's not forget the cold, hard cash and the logistical juggling act that kept those dreams alive on the rocky roads to Jerusalem. Fueling the dreams of knights during the Crusades was not merely about the clang of swords and the promise of spiritual redemption. It was a Game of Thrones long before HBO got involved. At its core, the Crusades were as much about politics and economics as they were about piety. Imagine a medieval version of Monopoly, where knights weren't just rolling dice, but crossing deserts, hoping to land on the Jerusalem square and collect their reward in the form of land and titles. Let's talk economics for a second. The allure of the Crusades for a knight was often driven by sheer necessity. In the 12th century, being a second or third son was a bit like being the middle child at Christmas, overlooked and often left with sarks instead of the prized toy. The tradition of primogeniture dictated that the eldest son inherited everything, leaving younger siblings scrambling for scraps. Thus, the Holy Land wasn't just a spiritual destination, it was a potential gold mine. A successful crusader could return home with spoils that included land grants, titles, and enough wealth to make a medieval Jeff Bezos blush. The church, ever the savvy marketer, sweetened the deal by offering indulgences, essentially a get-out-of-purgatory free card. These were like spiritual coupons redeemable in the afterlife, making the whole bloody endeavor seem like a celestial investment plan. Add to that the tantalizing tales of exotic lands and untold riches, and you've got a recipe for a migration of armored dreamers, each hoping to find their fortune or at least a decent plot of land to call their own. But it wasn't just economic ambition that fueled the flames. Social pressure played a formidable role. Imagine the medieval equivalent of keeping up with the Joneses, where proving your valor on the battlefield was akin to flaunting the latest iPhone. Knights were expected to uphold their family's honor and establish their own legacy. A successful crusade was a ticket to social prestige, a badge of honor that said, "I've been to the Holy Land and survived." Fail, and you risked returning to your village as the guy who couldn't even secure a tent in the desert, let alone a swath of land in Jerusalem. Religious fervor was the final ingredient in this heady cocktail. The 12th century was a time when faith was as integral as food and water, and the Pope's call to arms was a divine summons that resonated deeply. The idea of reclaiming Jerusalem for Christendom was a cause that transcended mere mortal concerns. For many knights, it was an opportunity to serve a higher purpose, a chance to walk in the footsteps of saints, and perhaps, if they were lucky, secure a one-way ticket to heavenly bliss. Yet, once these knights arrived in the Holy Land, they quickly discovered that the reality was less of a chivalric dream and more of a logistical nightmare. Consider the cultural shock of a Christmas in Jerusalem. Snow was swapped for sand, and the familiar carols were replaced by the call of the muezzin. Instead of roast goose, they were lucky to choke down a feast of hardtack and questionable wine. One knight, chronicled in the writings of Fulcher of Chartres, lamented the lack of familiar festivities, describing a makeshift Christmas feast that was more survival ration than celebration. The cultural clashes were as stark as they were unavoidable. The locals, with their strange customs and unfamiliar languages, were seen as both exotic and alien. For knights who had grown up in the cloistered world of European feudalism, the bustling markets of Jerusalem were a bewildering sight, full of spices, silks, and a cacophony of voices in tongues they couldn't understand. It was a veritable medieval melting pot, a chaotic blend of trade and tradition that was as disorienting as it was fascinating. And then there were the practical challenges. The Holy Land's arid climate was a far cry from the damp fields of England or the lush valleys of France. Armor, designed for the cooler climes of Europe, turned into metal ovens under the relentless sun. Horses, those trusty steeds, struggled in the heat, and knights found themselves fighting not just the enemy, but the elements. Disease was rampant, with dysentery and malaria often cutting down more knights than the opposing armies ever did. It was a harsh reminder that the path to glory was paved with more than just good intentions. Despite these adversities, the myth of the noble crusader persisted, a mix of hard reality and romantic legend that has captivated imaginations for centuries. The allure of the Crusades lay in their promise of transformation, a chance for knights to transcend their earthly struggles and achieve something truly magnificent. But as they spent Christmas under foreign skies, far from home and hearth, they were reminded that the journey was as much about survival as it was about salvation. In the end, these knights were both dreamers and pragmatists, caught between the desire for glory and the demands of reality. They embarked on their crusades with visions of grandeur, only to face the gritty truths of medieval warfare. Their story is one of adventure and ambition, a testament to the enduring power of myth and the unyielding march of history. As we continue to explore their journey, we'll peel back the layers of legend to uncover the human experiences that defined a knight's Christmas in the crucible of the Crusades. Stay tuned, because the road to Jerusalem is far from over, and the lessons these knights learned along the way continue to echo through the ages. So, as our knightly friends huddled under unfamiliar stars, trying to keep the spirit of Christmas alive amidst the sand dunes and siege towers, one might wonder, how exactly did these medieval warriors manage to inject a bit of Yuletide cheer into their crusading chaos? Let's just say it involved a fair bit of inventiveness. Imagine trying to host a holiday feast in the middle of a war zone. Picture a medieval potluck where the menu was less about what pairs best with mulled wine and more about what hadn't spoiled yet. For these knights, Christmas dinner might consist of salted pork and whatever local produce they could barter or borrow. Lemons, dates, and maybe, if they were lucky, a few olive branches. Bread, the stalwart staple, was often hard as a rock, earning it the charming nickname Toothbreaker. Bon appetit indeed. And then there was the wine, or rather, the vinegar masquerading as wine. With supply lines stretched thinner than a peasant's belt in winter, quality control was not exactly top-notch. The local vintages, while abundant, were often more akin to drinking a chemistry experiment gone awry. Still, in the spirit of the season, you can bet those knights raised their goblets high, toasting to anything that wasn't trying to kill them. Games and revelries were another way to stave off the creeping homesickness. Imagine knights in full armor playing a game of medieval football, which was less World Cup and more full-contact brawl. The rules were as flexible as a court jester's conscience, and the aim was simple: get the ball, or anything vaguely spherical, into the opposing camp. Injuries were common, but at least they were less fatal than a skirmish with the Saracens. Then there were the attempts to uphold European traditions. One chronicler, a chap named Ralph of Keene, mentions knights singing carols in Latin, a nostalgic nod to the Christmases of their youth. They'd gather in makeshift chapels, often just tents with a crucifix and some candles, to celebrate midnight mass. It was a poignant reminder of the faith that had driven them thousands of miles from home. A faith that was, at times, more comforting than the hard reality of their surroundings. But let's not gloss over the fact that maintaining holiday morale was about as easy as keeping a candle lit in a gale. Disease was the uninvited guest at every Christmas gathering. Malaria, dysentery, and scurvy were rampant, with the latter turning teeth into rare commodities. According to the records of Raymond of Aguilas, a chronicler who tagged along on the First Crusade, there were days when more knights succumbed to illness than to enemy swords. Merry Christmas, indeed, and supply shortages. Oh, they were the gift that kept on taking. The logistics of getting goods from Europe to Jerusalem were nightmarish. Ships braved perilous seas, only to be offloaded into the chaos of Crusader camps. The cost of transporting goods was astronomical, akin to shipping champagne to a desert. By the time supplies arrived, they were often pilfered, spoiled, or simply vanished into the black market ether. Yet, in the face of these challenges, the romantic image of the Crusader Christmas refuses to fade entirely. There's something indelibly human about the desire to celebrate, to carve out joy even in the bleakest of times. It's this persistence that kept the knights from succumbing to complete despair. A reminder that even amidst the carnage, camaraderie and tradition could shine through like a candle in the dark. The blend of European and local customs created an unexpected cultural tapestry. Some knights, more adventurous, or perhaps simply desperate to adapt, began to incorporate local traditions into their celebrations. They might partake in local delicacies, don colorful tunics inspired by the vibrant fabrics of the region, or even join in local festivities, albeit with a knightly twist. This cultural exchange wasn't always smooth. Of course, misunderstandings and mistrust were frequent companions, but it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, ever seeking connections in foreign lands. In this crucible of cultures, the knights discovered that the spirit of Christmas was not about the trappings or the feasts, but the shared hope for peace and goodwill. They were far from home, surrounded by the unfamiliar and often hostile, yet they clung to the rituals that reminded them of who they were and why they had come. It was a Christmas unlike any other, a patchwork of tradition and necessity, myth and reality. As the stars wheeled overhead, these knights might have gathered around a fire, their armor clinking softly as they shared stories of home, dreams of the future, and perhaps a prayer for peace. It was a moment of reflection, a pause in the relentless march of war, where the lines between crusader and pilgrim blurred and the harsh edges of reality softened, if only for a night. Thus, the tale of a knight's Christmas in the Holy Land is one of contrasts and contradictions, where the dream of chivalry meets the starkness of survival. It's a story that continues to unfold, with each knight writing their own chapter in the annals of history, leaving behind a legacy that is both romantic and real, a testament to the enduring spirit of adventure and the unyielding hope for a better tomorrow. As we delve further into this journey, we'll uncover more about the lives and loves of these medieval adventurers, their triumphs and trials, and their indomitable quest for meaning in a world at war. Stay with us, as the road to Jerusalem is far from its end, and the lessons learned continue to resonate through the corridors of time. As the stars wheeled overhead, these knights might have gathered around a fire, their armor clinking softly as they shared stories of home, dreams of the future, and perhaps a prayer for peace. But let's hit pause on the nostalgia reel for a moment and dive into the strategic and military implications of taking a holiday break during the Crusades. Because, believe it or not, even in the middle of a holy war, knights needed a breather. And here's where things get interesting. Now, if you're thinking that knights taking a break was all wine and song, think again. The medieval battlefield didn't exactly come with a snooze button. So when these guys decided to hang up their swords temporarily, it wasn't just about catching some R&R. It was a high-stakes gamble that could tilt the scales of warfare. Picture this: a bunch of armored men lounging about while enemies lurked nearby, sharpening their sabers and scheming about the next surprise attack. A holiday, more like a strategic timeout with a side of anxiety. Take, for instance, the infamous Siege of Antioch, which dragged on from October 1097 to June 1098. As the First Crusade's winter chill set in, the knights were in a pickle. Supplies were running low, morale was dipping faster than a knight's lance, and taking a break was as tempting as that last piece of hardtack. But pausing a siege could mean the difference between victory and a very public, very medieval failure. The leaders, like Bohemond of Taranto, had to juggle the need to rest weary troops with the risk of losing momentum. And then there was the ever-looming threat of a sneak attack. If you think holiday sharping is stressful, try coordinating a truce in enemy territory. Communication, or the lack thereof, played a starring role here. Coordinating a ceasefire required more than just shouting over the battlements. It was about crafting a delicate dance of signals, messengers, and sometimes sheer luck. In a world where the fastest message traveled at the speed of horse, misunderstandings were as common as crusader blisters. One wrong move, and what was meant to be a peaceful pause could spiral into chaos faster than you can say misfire. Yet, against the odds, there were moments when the lines of communication held, and an uneasy peace settled over the battlefield. It's a testament to the tenacity, and dare I say, stubborn optimism of these medieval warriors. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't about peace, love, and understanding. It was more akin to playing a high-stakes game of chess, with lives hanging in the balance. The stakes? Well, let's just say they were a touch higher than your average family board game. Balancing the need for rest with the constant threat of conflict was a tightrope walk that made even the most agile knights sweat. For leaders, it was about making the right call at the right time, decisions that could make or break a campaign. During the Siege of Acre in 1189, a 3-year marathon of misery, Richard the Lionheart famously juggled sieges with strategic breaks. His troops were worn thin, their armor shining less from polish and more from the relentless sun. Richard knew that downtime was crucial, but he also understood that too long a pause could give Saladin's forces the upper hand. The result? A calculated blend of combat and rest, ensuring his men remained sharp without giving the enemy an inch. But even with the best-laid plans, there was always the wild card, the surprise attack. Nothing says Merry Christmas quite like an enemy sneaking up while your back is turned. These ambushes were the stuff of nightmares, often turning a knight's holiday into a desperate fight for survival. The chronicles of the time are peppered with tales of armies caught off guard, their leaders scrambling to rally troops who'd just been dreaming of a peaceful ceasefire. It was a brutal reminder that in the Middle Ages, vigilance was as vital as valor. In all this, let's not forget the human element. Knights were, after all, just men. Men who, like us, needed time to recharge, to reflect, and to reconnect with their purpose. The breaks, brief as they were, offered a rare moment to remember why they had crossed continents in the first place. It was a chance to bond over shared hardships, to bolster each other's spirits, and to reignite the fire that had driven them to the Holy Land. It was these moments of camaraderie that often turned the tide, providing the psychological boost needed to face yet another day of grueling warfare. As the knights huddled around campfires, swapping stories and strategizing for the battles ahead, they were living proof that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit could find a way to endure. Their story is one of resilience and resourcefulness, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the relentless pursuit of a better tomorrow. And as we continue this journey, exploring the strategic and emotional landscapes these knights navigated, uncover even more about the trials and triumphs that define their extraordinary lives. So, while the idea of a knight's Christmas break might seem quaint from our modern perspective, it was anything but. It was a complex dance of strategy, survival, and the unyielding quest for glory. And as the Crusades unfolded, these pauses in fighting became as much a part of the tapestry as the battles themselves, shaping the course of history in ways both profound and unexpected. Stay tuned, because the saga of the Crusades is far from over, and the stories of these armored adventurers continue to captivate and inspire. Yet, as the dust settled on the battlefield and the knights began their long trek home, the Crusades left behind a legacy that echoed far beyond the clang of swords and the cries of battle. Imagine, if you will, a cultural ripple effect that transformed societies on both sides of the Mediterranean, introducing new ideas, goods, and, yes, even a few culinary delights that have survived to this day. Let's start with the tangible spoils of war. Knights returning to Europe didn't just bring back trinkets and tales. They ushered in a wave of Eastern influence that would reshape the medieval world. Spices like saffron and cinnamon became the medieval equivalent of high-end bling, adding zest and prestige to the bland European diet. The introduction of sugar, previously a luxury item, began its sweet revolution here, eventually leading to the modern confectionery aisle that tempts us all during the holiday season. And let's not forget the humble apricot and the almond, which made their European debut thanks to these intrepid adventurers. But it wasn't all about the culinary exchange. The Crusades were also a conduit for knowledge. Think of it as the world's most grueling study abroad program. Islamic scholarship, particularly in medicine and philosophy, flowed into Europe, sparking new intellectual fervor. Greek classics, long lost to the West, returned via Arabic translations, reigniting interest in Aristotle and paving the way for what would later be known as the Renaissance. Mathematics, too, benefited. The introduction of Arabic numerals was a game-changer, making Roman numerals look like the clunky relics they were. Now, this cultural cross-pollination wasn't a one-way street. The Middle East absorbed European customs and practices, though perhaps with a raised eyebrow or two. The Franks, as the Crusaders were called, were known for their peculiar habits, like bathing only once a year, whether they needed it or not. It's a wonder any cultural exchange happened at all, given the fragrant nature of these meetings. Yet, despite the olfactory obstacles, the blend of East and West left an indelible mark on everything from architecture to agriculture. So, what about those knights, the supposed paragons of chivalric glory? Well, the reality of their homecoming was often less triumphal march and more awkward shuffle. Many returned with empty pockets and shattered dreams. Remember, the Crusades were a costly affair, and not every knight managed to secure the riches or status they'd set out for. In fact, historians estimate that up to 75% of knights returned no richer than they'd left. Their only souvenirs the scars of battle and stories that seemed increasingly unbelievable with each retelling. And then there were the psychological scars. Imagine facing the mundane after the adrenaline-fueled chaos of war. It's a bit like trying to adjust to office life after spending years as an extreme sports athlete. Many knights found themselves grappling with what we now recognize as PTSD, a condition that medieval society was woefully ill-equipped to handle. This wasn't the stuff of ballads or romantic tales. It was gritty, it was real, and it was a stark reminder that the chivalric myth often glossed over the harsh truths of medieval warfare. Yet, despite the hardships, the legend of the noble crusader persisted. The church, eager to keep the narrative of holy warriors alive, spun tales that glossed over the less savory aspects of knightly life. Think of it as medieval PR at its finest, ensuring that the allure of chivalry remained intact for future generations. After all, who wants to hear about the knight who came home with nothing but a sunburn and a bad case of dysentery, when you can hear about the one who single-handedly captured a Saracen fortress? And now, let's bring it back to the present, where our holiday stresses seem positively quaint by comparison. The next time you find yourself frazzled by the thought of cooking dinner for 12 or navigating the minefield of family politics, spare a thought for those knights of yore. They dealt with logistics that make our modern woes look like a walk in the park. Forget about finding a parking spot at the mall. These guys were trying to find a safe spot to pitch a tent amidst hostile territory. In the end, the Crusades were more than just a series of military campaigns. They were a crucible that forged new connections and reshaped the world in unforeseen ways. They were a testament to human ambition, folly, and resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the quest for knowledge, adventure, and connection can lead to surprising and lasting change. So as you gather around your holiday table, perhaps with a dish or two inspired by those ancient exchanges, remember the knights who braved deserts and seas, not just for glory, but for a future they could scarcely imagine. And with that, our tale draws to a close, leaving you with a fresh perspective on the tangled web of history, a reminder that the past is never as far away as it seems, and that the stories of those who came before continue to shape our world in ways both profound and unexpected. Safe travels, wherever your own adventures may take you, and may your holiday season be filled with the kind of peace and goodwill that even the hardiest of knights would envy. Ever wondered what it was like to be a Viking berserker? Yeah, those guys who supposedly transformed into raging beasts and fought with the fury of 100 angry cats. Well, here's the thing. Becoming a berserker wasn't just about darning a bear skin and calling it a day. Nope, it was a lifestyle choice that came with its own set of bizarre rituals and a reputation that would make even the bravest warrior think twice before engaging in a duel. Let's set the scene. It's the 8th century, and you find yourself in the cold, windswept lands of Scandinavia. Life is tough, resources are scarce, and if you're not careful, you'll end up as a footnote in a saga rather than the hero. Enter the Berserkers, a group of elite warriors who were as feared as they were misunderstood. Now, legends would have you believe they were supernatural beings capable of transforming into bears or wolves during battle. Cool, right? Except not exactly true. The origins of these wild warriors are shrouded in mystery, but scholars suggest their rise coincides with the Viking Age, starting around 793 AD. While some tales paint them as the Norse equivalent of the Hulk, the reality was far more grounded and slightly less glamorous. The term berserker itself likely comes from the Old Norse words ber, bear, and serker, shirt, hinting at their practice of wearing animal pelts. But before you start imagining a Viking fashion show, remember that these were practical folks. Wearing bear skins wasn't just a fashion statement. It was about channeling the strength and ferocity of the bear, which, last I checked, isn't exactly a bad role model when you're about to charge into battle. But what made a berserker tick? It wasn't just the animal skins or the intimidating growls. Some historians argue they might have used psychoactive substances to enter their famous frenzy, a kind of ancient and possibly more lethal energy drink. However, the jury is still out on this theory. No hard evidence has definitively tied them to the Viking version of psychedelics. Instead, it's possible their legendary fury was more psychological than pharmaceutical. Imagine the adrenaline rush you get from knowing your reputation alone could send enemies running. Now, before you go thinking these guys were just mindless brutes, remember that being a berserker was a social status symbol. They weren't just warriors, they were rock stars of the Viking world. Their presence in a battle was akin to having a secret weapon, a one-man army that could turn the tide. And this status didn't come cheap. Training to become a berserker required dedication, and being accepted into their ranks was no small feat. It's likely they underwent rigorous trials to prove their worth, a far cry from simply donning a bear pelt and calling yourself a warrior. Despite the myths, the truth is that berserkers weren't invincible. They could be, and were killed just like any other warrior. but their fearsome reputation often did most of the fighting for them. In a world where psychological warfare was just as important as physical combat, the Berserkers were masters of both. They harnessed their fearsome notoriety to instill terror long before swords were drawn. It's kind of like having a reputation for never losing at poker. Sometimes, it's not the cards you hold, but the face you show. So why did these warriors become legends? Part of it is the allure of the supernatural. We love a good story, and the idea of warriors who could transform into beasts and fight with superhuman strength is just too good to resist. But like many legends, the truth is rooted in reality, one that's infinitely more complex and human. The Berserkers were a product of their time, shaped by the harsh realities of Viking life and warfare. Their rituals, practices, and reputations were all part of a carefully curated image that served both practical and psychological purposes. As you contemplate the life of a berserker, it's worth considering the duality of their existence. On one hand, they were elite warriors with a fearsome reputation. On the other, they were humans living in a brutal world, using every tool at their disposal, be it psychological, sartorial, or potentially chemical, to survive and thrive. So the next time you hear tales of these mythical warriors, remember, behind every legend is a person, and behind every myth, a reality that's often just as fascinating. Our Viking berserkers were more than just the rock stars of the battlefield. They were also key players in the intricate social jigsaw puzzle that was the Norse world. While it's tempting to imagine them solely as bloodthirsty warriors whose only hobby was perfecting the art of the battle cry, the truth is a tad more nuanced. Picture them as the rough-edged, yet vital, cogs in the Viking societal machine, a machine that ran on more than just pillage and plunder. Let's talk Turkey, or rather silver, which was the currency of choice in the Viking Age. You see, Vikings weren't just about the raids. They were savvy traders who helped weave a web of commerce stretching from the icy shores of Newfoundland to the bustling bazaars of Baghdad. In this commercial tapestry, berserkers were not just the muscle, but also the enforcers of trade agreements, ensuring that deals were honored and merchants were protected. Their fierce reputation meant that just the sight of a berserker could guarantee a smoother transaction than any verbal contract. Now, you might be picturing a berserker flipping over a merchant stall for dramatic effect, but their role was more about deterrence than destruction. These guys were the original bouncers of the Viking trade routes, ensuring that everybody played nice, or else. This was crucial in a world where trust was as rare as a polite Viking. And speaking of trade, let's not forget the hefty price tag that came with maintaining the berserkers' fearsome presence. Their invaluable service didn't come cheap, and their upkeep was a direct investment into the economic security of Norse societies. So how did these larger-than-life figures fit into the everyday Viking community when they weren't busy terrifying enemies or safeguarding commerce? Well, societal roles in the Norse world were as fluid as the fjords themselves. Berserkers, despite their wild reputations, were often integral to the communities they hailed from and were very much embedded in the local social strata, whether it was through marriage alliances, which strengthened familial ties, or by participating in local gatherings like the Thing, a Norse assembly where disputes were settled and laws were made. They were more than just combatants, they were community members. But let's not kid ourselves. Being a berserker wasn't all about civic duty and annual meetings. There was also an element of social prestige involved. In a hierarchical society, where status could be as fleeting as a summer day in Norway, being a berserker was a ticket to the Viking upper echelons. It was a status that offered both power and protection. You weren't just someone who fought in battle. You were a symbol of your clan's strength and honor. And in a world where reputation could mean the difference between life and death, that was a currency worth its weight in silver. Now, here's where we debunk another myth, that berserkers were just rampaging lunatics. In reality, they were also strategic thinkers. Consider this. In a time when alliances could change as quickly as the weather, berserkers were often involved in the politics of warfare. They were the ones who could turn the tide of a battle, and their allegiance was a prize sought after by Viking leaders. It wasn't just about the brute force they could exert, but the psychological edge they brought to any conflict. Their exploits, both on and off the battlefield, had ripple effects on the Norse economy and social structures. For instance, the spoils of their raids didn't just vanish into thin air. They were often reinvested into their communities, funding everything from shipbuilding to local feasts. And while it might sound like a Norse version of trickle-down economics, it actually played a role in sustaining and even boosting local economies. It's ironic, really. The men who were masters of chaos also helped sustain the very order they often disrupted. So, as we peel back the layers of myth surrounding the Berserkers, we're left with a picture that's both more grounded and infinitely more intriguing. They were enforcers, traders, community leaders, and yes, fearsome warriors. Their lives were as complex as the society they helped shape. A society that wasn't just about surviving but thriving in one of history's most challenging landscapes. And as we continue to explore their world, remember, the Vikings may have been infamous for their raids, but it was their ability to adapt and innovate that truly set them apart. And the Berserkers, they were the wild, untamed heart beating at the center of it all. So, what exactly was in the Berserkers' secret sauce? It's time to delve into the murky world of Viking rituals and substances, where reality often blurs with legend, and modern portrayals might be more fantasy than fact. The idea that these warriors were just popping mushrooms like they were at an ancient Woodstock is as alluring as it is speculative. Historical texts and archaeological finds give us some clues, but they also leave us with more questions than answers. Let's address the elephant, or should I say, reindeer, in the room: psychoactive substances. One popular theory suggests Berserkers might have consumed Amanita muscaria, a mushroom known for its hallucinogenic properties. If you've ever seen those classic red and white toadstools in fairy tale illustrations, that's the one. The theory goes that munching on these fungi could have sent our Berserkers into a trance-like rage. But before you start picturing a Viking rave, here's the catch. There's scant hard evidence to support this. No Viking-era mushroom snack packs have been found, and the effects of Amanita muscaria are more likely to cause nausea and confusion than battle-ready mania. Not exactly the qualities you'd want when facing a horde of enemies. The allure of this theory is undeniable, though. It taps into our fascination with altered states and the idea that the Berserkers had a secret edge. But perhaps the true secret weapon was something a bit more familiar: alcohol. Yeah, the age-old liquid courage. Mead, a fermented honey drink, was practically Viking Gatorade, fueling warriors before battle. While it's unlikely they were chugging it mid-fight, no one wants to wield an axe with a hangover. Alcohol could have played a role in pre-battle rituals, helping to psych them up and dull their fear. It's not as flashy as psychedelic mushrooms, but it's certainly more plausible. And what about those wild rituals? Some accounts suggest Berserkers engaged in practices that were as terrifying as they were theatrical. Imagine a group of warriors, stripped to the waist, howling like wolves and biting their shields. It's a scene straight out of a heavy metal music video, but it's also rooted in documented rituals meant to invoke the spirits of animals. This wasn't just for show. It was a psychological strategy. By channeling the ferocity of a bear or the cunning of a wolf, Berserkers aimed to strike fear into the hearts of their enemies before the battle even began. This is psychological warfare 101, and in a time when belief in the supernatural was as real as the cold steel of a sword, it was incredibly effective. Speaking of the supernatural, let's talk about the role of religion and spirituality in these rituals. The Norse pantheon was filled with gods who were as fierce as they were fickle, and Berserkers saw themselves as conduits for divine power. Odin, the all-father of the gods, was particularly revered by these warriors. Known as the god of war and death, Odin was a fitting patron for those who lived by the sword. In seeking his favor, Berserkers might have engaged in rituals designed to invoke his presence, believing that his divine intervention could turn the tide of battle. This wasn't just about faith. It was a tactical move in a world where the gods were seen as active participants in human affairs. It's also worth noting that the Berserkers' fearsome reputation wasn't just for the benefit of their enemies. Within their own communities, these rituals reinforced their status and solidified their identities as warriors beyond compare. It was a form of branding, if you will. A Berserker without his rituals would be like a rock star without his guitar. Still talented, perhaps, but lacking the full impact. So while modern audiences might be drawn to the idea of mind-altering substances, the reality is that the Berserkers were masters of manipulation, using ritual and reputation as their primary tools. Now, let's mythbust another romantic notion, that these were lone wolves, operating outside the norms of Viking society. In reality, They were often tightly knit groups, bound by shared experiences and mutual trust. These bonds were crucial, as the life of a berserker was as dangerous as it was glamorous. They needed to rely on each other in battle and in the complex social dynamics of the Viking world. This camaraderie was forged through shared rituals and the collective belief in their unique role within society. As we sift through the layers of myth and reality, it's clear that the berserkers' fury was likely fueled by a combination of factors: ritual, belief, adrenaline, and maybe a splash of alcohol. Their legendary status was built not just on their prowess in battle, but on their ability to captivate and terrify through performance. They were the rock stars of their time, yes, but also consummate actors in the grand theater of Viking warfare. And with that, we have only scratched the surface of the berserker mystique. As we continue to explore their world, remember that history is as much about the stories we tell as it is about the facts we uncover. The berserkers, with their blend of reality and legend, are a perfect example of this dynamic. They invite us to question what we think we know, and to embrace the complexity of a past that's as wild and unpredictable as the warriors themselves. So stay tuned, because this saga is far from over. So here we are, knee-deep in the saga of the Viking berserkers, teetering on the edge of their notorious reputation and the political chessboard of the Viking Age. Now, you might think these guys were just the brawn behind the brain, but hold onto your horned helmets. There's more political intrigue here than in a season finale of your favorite fantasy series. Let's break it down. It's the Viking Age, circa 9th to 11th centuries, a time when Norse chieftains and kings were less about sitting on thrones and more about staying on top of their game. Enter the berserkers, who were not merely warriors but political assets with a reputation that could make or break an alliance. In a world where power was as unstable as a Viking longship in a storm, the berserkers were the ultimate wild cards. Chieftains employed these fearsome fighters like you'd hire a PR firm today. Their job, not just to fight, but to intimidate and impress. Imagine a negotiation table where your leverage is a band of raging warriors who could, on a whim, turn the tide of any skirmish. It's like bringing a flamethrower to a knife fight. The berserkers were the nuclear option, the ones who could secure peace simply by existing. Here's the kicker. Their fearsome image was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it was a powerful tool for propaganda. Remember, this was a time long before social media spin. Instead, you had sagas and skalds, Norse bards, if you will, spreading tales faster than a raven flies. These stories were the lifeblood of Viking reputation management. A well-timed saga could bolster a chieftain's standing, and having berserkers included in these tales was like getting a celebrity endorsement. But with great power comes great unpredictability. The berserkers weren't exactly the poster children for stability, and their volatility could be a political liability. Chieftains had to balance the benefits of their brutal prowess with the risk of them going rogue. The political landscape was a tightrope walk, with alliances as fragile as a Viking ship's hull in a storm. A chieftain who could successfully harness the berserkers' power gained not just military might, but a psychological edge over rivals. And let's talk economics because, spoiler alert, war isn't cheap. Sustaining a berserker wasn't just about feeding them a steady diet of mead and bear pelts. It required resources, and lots of them. Maintaining their loyalty was akin to managing a high-risk, high-reward investment portfolio. The cost of keeping berserkers in your corner could be offset by the spoils of war, loot from raids, tributes from subjugated territories, or even trade agreements guaranteed by their fearsome presence. Now, here's the part where we debunk a myth that's as stubborn as a Viking in a drinking contest. Berserkers as lone wolves, operating outside the law. In truth, they were often deeply embedded within the power structures of Viking society. Chieftains didn't just employ them as mercenaries. They integrated them into the fabric of their political apparatus. Think of them as special ops forces of the Viking world, with their loyalty often secured through familial alliances or land grants. This integration wasn't just practical, it was strategic. By weaving berserkers into the social and political tapestry, chieftains could ensure their loyalty and stability. It was a masterclass in feudal politics. Keep your friends close and your berserkers closer. The presence of these warriors at a chieftain's side was a statement in itself, a declaration of power and a deterrent against potential usurpers. But what about those infamous berserker rages? Weren't they just ticking time bombs? Yes and no. Their frenzies were as much a part of their legend as their reality, while tales of them biding their shields and roaring into battle make for great storytelling. The strategic use of this reputation was even more fascinating. A controlled berserker rage could be unleashed at the perfect moment, turning a skirmish into a rout. However, managing this unpredictable force required a deft political touch. Chieftains who mastered this art could wield the berserker's fury like a sword, sharp and decisive. In a society where power was often won and lost on the battlefield, the berserkers were the trump card. Their influence stretched beyond their immediate circle, affecting the broader geopolitical dynamics of the Viking world. They were both the catalysts of conflict and the brokers of peace, their mere presence a statement of intent and capability. A chieftain with berserkers was a force to be reckoned with, a player in the high-stakes Game of Thrones long before it became a pop culture phenomenon. As we delve deeper into their role in Viking politics, it's clear that the berserkers were more than just warriors. They were a testament to the complexities of power and the human condition. Their story is one of ambition, manipulation, and survival in a world that revered strength and feared chaos. So, as we continue this journey through the annals of Viking history, remember, the berserkers weren't just part of the legend. They were the ones who helped write it. And the saga isn't over yet. Stick around, because the next chapter promises to be just as wild and unpredictable as the warriors themselves. And so, with the Berserkers saga unfolding like a complex tapestry of chaos and charisma, we turn our gaze to the modern era, where the echoes of their legendary roars still resonate. These warriors, with their blend of myth and muscle, have left an indelible mark on our cultural landscape, proving that some stories are too good to be left in the past. Fast forward a few centuries, and you'll find berserkers reimagined in everything from epic fantasy novels to Hollywood blockbusters. They're the archetype of the untamed warrior, the embodiment of primal rage harnessed for a just cause, or at least, that's how we like to picture them. It's the kind of narrative that sells tickets and pages alike, a romanticized vision where the gritty realities of Viking life are airbrushed away, leaving behind a story that's more palatable to modern audiences. Consider the literary world. J.R.R. Tolkien, the granddaddy of high fantasy, drew heavily on Norse mythology, and you can see shades of berserkers in his creations. The idea of warriors who tap into an otherworldly fury echoes throughout Middle-earth, though Tolkien, with his academic hat on, was probably more interested in the philological roots than the bloody business of real berserker life. And let's not forget the countless video games where players can channel their inner Viking warrior, often with a rage mode button that's just a berserker frenzy in digital form. It's a testament to how this ancient archetype has been adapted to fit modern narratives, where the line between reality and fantasy blurs faster than you can say Valhalla. In film, the berserker image is often polished to a shiny, cinematic sheen. Take the Marvel superhero Thor, whose mythological roots are deeply entwined with Viking lore. While Thor himself is more about thunder and less about berserking, the idea of a powerful, unstoppable force is very much in line with what we imagine a berserker to be. Hollywood loves a good transformation story, and berserkers fit the bill perfectly. They're the underdogs who, through sheer will and a touch of madness, rise to become heroes. It's a story arc that resonates, tapping into our fascination with the duality of strength and vulnerability. But why do these ancient warriors still capture our imagination? Part of it is the allure of the untamed. In a world where most of us are more likely to wage war over Wi-Fi than with weapons, the berserker represents a primal part of our psyche, the raw, unfiltered rage that we sometimes wish we could unleash. It's the fantasy of being able to channel our frustrations into something powerful and transformative, a concept that's deeply appealing in our increasingly sanitized society. Then there's the mystique of the supernatural. Despite our scientific advancements, we remain captivated by the unknown, the unexplainable. Berserkers, with their purported ability to transform into beasts, tap into this fascination. Whether it's the idea of channeling animalistic power, or the notion of a warrior who's more than human, there's something irresistibly compelling about the supernatural elements of their legend. It's the kind of story that invites us to suspend disbelief, to embrace the fantastical in a world that often feels too mundane. Yet, as we romanticize these ancient warriors, it's crucial to remember the harsher truths of their existence. Life, for a berserker, was anything but a fairy tale. The reality was a gritty, brutal struggle for survival in a world where the line between life and death was razor-thin. Their ferocity wasn't just a narrative device. It was a necessary adaptation to the harsh conditions of the Viking Age. These warriors were not just characters in a saga. They were real people facing real challenges, using every tool, from psychological tactics to social alliances, to carve out a place in a world that was often unforgiving. Despite the myths, the Berserkers' legacy is a complex one. They were both feared and revered, seen as both heroes and pariahs. Their image has been co-opted, reimagined, and sometimes sanitized, but at their core, they represent a raw, untamed spirit that refuses to be fully understood or contained. In a way, the Berserkers are the ultimate symbol of the human condition, capable of great violence and great courage, driven by a blend of instinct, emotion, and a dash of madness. As we wrap up our exploration of these legendary warriors, it's worth reflecting on what their story tells us about ourselves. The Berserkers remind us of the enduring power of myth, the way stories can transcend time and place to speak to something universal within us. They challenge us to consider the dual nature of humanity, the capacity for both creation and destruction, for reason and chaos. And while the Berserkers themselves are long gone, their legend lives on, a testament to the enduring appeal of a good story and the complex tapestry of history that continues to shape our world. So, the next time you find yourself caught up in the latest Viking saga or wielding a digital axe in a video game, remember the real Berserkers. Remember their grit and their glory, their myths and their realities. Because in the end, it's not just about the stories we tell, but what those stories reveal about us. And with the Berserkers, we find a reflection of the wild, untamed spirit that lies at the heart of human nature. It's a legacy worth remembering, a saga worth telling. If you were wandering through the jungles of Mesoamerica around 1,000 years ago, you'd find yourself in the shadow of towering pyramids and in the company of some of the most enigmatic figures in history, the Maya priests. These were the folks who didn't just wear fancy hats and chant in ancient tongues. They were the real power brokers of their time. Spiritual leaders, absolutely, but they were also political heavyweights and the fiscal force behind the grandiose public spectacles that made the Maya civilization so dazzling and occasionally so brutal. Let's be honest, the Maya priests weren't just about incense and introspection. Oh no, they were the ultimate multitaskers. They orchestrated rituals that would make any modern festival planner weep with envy. Think Coachella, but with more sacrificial knives. And they didn't just do it for fun. Every ceremony was a calculated move in a complex game of spiritual and political chess. These guys knew how to work a crowd and wield influence with a flair that would put modern politicians to shame. Now, before we dive into the blood-soaked details, let's talk about why these priests mattered so much. In a world where the gods were as real as the people you passed in the street, priests were the intermediaries between the divine and the mortal. They could make or break the harvest, win or lose the war, and essentially decide if your next few years would be prosperous or plagued. It's no surprise they were treated with a reverence that bordered on fear. You wanted these guys on your side, trust me. But being a priest wasn't just about having a heartline to the heavens. It was also about managing a pretty hefty budget. The costs of maintaining the priesthood and their elaborate rituals were sky high. We're talking about copious amounts of food, textiles, jade, and other valuable goods that were poured into these ceremonial events. You see, every time a priest donned a feathered headdress and took to the steps of a pyramid, it was like throwing a massive party. Only instead of party favors, you might get a bloodletting ritual. And that stuff wasn't cheap. Let's put some numbers to it. A single ceremony could involve hundreds of participants, vast quantities of food, and the kind of bling that would make a rapper blush. The economic engine that kept this machine running was fueled by tributes from the common folk and the spoils of war. If you were a farmer or a merchant, part of your haul went to keeping the gods happy. It was like a divine tax, and priests were the collectors. But how exactly did these priests keep their grip on society? It wasn't all smoke and mirrors, though there was plenty of that too. Priests' influence was cemented by their role as astronomers and mathematicians. They were the keepers of the calendar, predicting celestial events and interpreting them as divine messages. When your very survival depended on knowing when to plant and when to harvest, you didn't question the guy who could read the stars. Timing was everything, and these priests had it down to an art. What's fascinating is how the priests managed to blend their religious duties with their political ambitions. In many Maya cities, the line between priest and ruler was as blurred as a watercolor painting left out in the rain. The rulers often claimed divine ancestry, and the priests were their PR team, backing up these claims with elaborate ceremonies that reinforced the ruler's status as a god's chosen emissary. It was a neat trick. One hand washed the other, and both hands were firmly in control of the people. But let's not romanticize it too much. The Maya civilization was a complex web of city-states, each with its own hierarchy and power struggles. Priests were constantly navigating these waters, forming alliances and rivalries that could turn on a dime. And when tensions boiled over, it was often the priesthood that orchestrated the rituals to appease or provoke the gods, depending on what the situation demanded. They were the ultimate spin doctors, crafting narratives that kept the populace in line and the rulers on their thrones. You might be wondering how all of this looked on the ground. Picture a bustling cityscape of limestone and stucco, with priests leading processions through plazas where the air was thick with the smell of copal incense. The temples loomed above, their staircases stained by the passage of time, and occasionally by more sinister fluids. The rituals were spectacles of sound and color, with drums and flutes creating a cacophony that echoed through the jungle. It was sensory overload, designed to inspire awe and reinforce the power of the priesthood. And then there were the darker aspects. The bloodletting and human sacrifices that punctuated these rituals were not just for show. They were believed to nourish the gods and ensure the cosmic order. The priests, often from noble families themselves, led by example, drawing their own blood in acts of piety that underscored their commitment to their sacred duties. It was a brutal business, but in their worldview it was essential. Let's not sugarcoat it. The life of a Maya priest was a high-stakes balancing act. They were the linchpins of a society where religion and politics were inextricably linked. Maintaining their status required not just spiritual insight, but also political savvy and economic acumen. It's a testament to their skill that they managed to hold sway for centuries in a civilization as vibrant and volatile as the Maya. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine the flickering torchlight casting long shadows over the temple steps, the rhythmic chants of the priests weaving through the night air. You might just catch a glimpse of the intricate dance of power and piety that defined the ancient Maya world, a world where the line between the divine and the mortal was as thin as a knife's edge. Now, stepping from the shadowy grandeur of Maya temples into the gritty specifics of their rituals, we delve into the spine-tingling details that make the bloodletting ceremonies an ancient standout. And make no mistake, these weren't your run-of-the-mill ceremonial affairs. They were more like a high-stakes performance art with cosmic implications. We're talking about a level of commitment that would put method actors to shame. Picture this, a priest armed with an obsidian blade sharper than your wits on a Monday morning, piercing their own skin to feed the gods. Why, you ask? Because in the Maya cosmos, blood was the red bull that gave the gods wings. It was the life force, the ultimate offering to ensure harmony between the celestial and earthly realms. Now, let's shred some Hollywood myths. While pop culture loves to paint these priests as sadistic, bloodthirsty maniacs, the reality is a tad more nuanced. Yes, blood was shed, but it wasn't a gore fest for kicks. Bloodletting was a deeply spiritual act, often performed to mark significant events like births, deaths, or the crowning of a new ruler. It was a sacrifice that the priests and the nobility undertook willingly, their own blood a testament to their piety and dedication. This wasn't about brutality for brutality's sake. It was a communal act of devotion, with everyone from the king to the commoner joining in. A bit like a horrifically intense team-building exercise, but with more existential stakes. But hey, let's not gloss over the physical demands. Imagine the psychological fortitude required to slice your own flesh with a thorn-studded rope or an obsidian knife, knowing that your life force was the currency keeping cosmic order in check. And here's a fun fact. Bleeding wasn't just limited to arms or legs. Oh no, the Maya took the phrase, go big or go home, to heart. Tongues and genitals were prime real estate for these offerings, with the resulting blood collected on paper and burned as a sacred incense. It's a wonder anyone could make it through a ceremony without fainting, which, let's be honest, is probably why the priests were so revered. If you could survive that, you'd earned your spot at the top. The societal pressures to keep these traditions alive were immense. Imagine living in a world where failing to appease the gods could mean the difference between a bountiful harvest and a crippling drought. The stakes were high, and everyone was invested in the outcome. This wasn't just about individual devotion, it was a collective responsibility. And here's where the economic context kicks in. These rituals were costly. We're not just talking about the blood, sweat, and tears of the participants. The paraphernalia required, the ritual blades, the elaborate costumes, the copal incense, demanded resources that had to be sourced, crafted, and maintained. It was a whole industry, a religious economy that kept artisans employed and trade routes bustling. Now, let's pivot to the lesser-known events that punctuated the Maya ceremonial calendar. While bloodletting grabs the spotlight, rituals like the ball game were equally significant, if not as gruesome. This wasn't your everyday kickabout. It was a high-stakes game with players bouncing a hefty rubber ball off their hips, aiming to pass it through stone hoops set high on the court walls. Victorious teams didn't just earn bragging rights. They often participated in subsequent rituals that could involve offerings to the gods. And yes, sometimes these offerings included the hearts of the losing team. Yikes. Talk about a game of life and death. But let's be clear, we're not just talking about sporting events gone wrong. The ball game was a microcosm of the cosmic struggle, a symbolic reenactment of the eternal battle between day and night, life and death. This was theater with real-world stakes, and the psychological pressure on participants was immense. Imagine stepping onto that court, knowing that the outcome could determine your fate, or worse, the fate of your entire community. It's a wonder anyone volunteered to play, but such was the power of belief, the pull of destiny. The players weren't just athletes, they were warriors, priests, and in the eyes of their people, potential martyrs. The societal mechanisms that perpetuated these traditions were intricate and relentless. From birth, individuals were steeped in the lore and expectations of their culture. The priesthood, with its blend of mysticism and practical governance, was the linchpin holding everything together. They were the gatekeepers of tradition, ensuring that each generation understood the gravity and necessity of these rituals. It was a form of social conditioning, a way of life that left little room for dissent. In a society where the divine and the mundane were so tightly interwoven, questioning the status quo wasn't just rebellious, it was dangerous. And while we're busting myths, let's address the notion that these rituals were solely about control. Sure, they reinforced the power structures, but they also provided a sense of stability in a world fraught with uncertainty. The Maya believed that their actions could influence the gods, that their sacrifices could tip the balance between chaos and order. It was a worldview that placed immense responsibility on human shoulders, a belief system that demanded participation from every stratum of society. In this context, the priests weren't just power-hungry manipulators. They were the custodians of cosmic balance, the intermediaries tasked with ensuring the survival of their people. So, as we wrap up this segment of our journey into the heart of Maya ritual, let's acknowledge the duality at play. The rituals were both brutal and beautiful, an expression of humanity's eternal struggle to make sense of the universe. They were a testament to the ingenuity and resilience of a civilization that, despite its flaws, managed to thrive in a challenging environment. As we peel back the layers of myth and reality, we find a complex tapestry woven from threads of devotion, power, and survival. And while we've only scratched the surface, there's plenty more to uncover as we continue to explore the fascinating world of the ancient Maya. Stay tuned, because the best, or perhaps the most bewildering, is yet to come. All right, let's dive back into the swirling mists of Maya history, where factual precision meets a splash of Hollywood-style drama. You've heard the tales of human sacrifices, and yes, they're as spine-chilling as they sound. But let's peel back the layers and find out why these rituals weren't just a grim case of ancient overkill. Spoiler alert, it's more than just feeding the gods' insatiable appetite for drama. First up, let's debunk the myth that Maya priests were just bloodthirsty fiends with a penchant for dramatic flair. The truth is, human sacrifice was a ritual drenched in symbolism. In the Maya worldview, the universe was a delicate balance of forces, and maintaining this balance sometimes required a life to be given. It wasn't gratuitous. It was cosmic housekeeping. Sure, the idea of flinging a heart into a cenote might not resonate today, but in the Maya mindset, it was akin to renewing your subscription to the universe's order. Now, let's talk facts and figures. The scale of human sacrifice in Maya culture isn't as widespread as some might think. Archaeologists have excavated sites like Chichen Itza, uncovering evidence that these rituals were significant, but not the everyday affair they are often depicted as. Excavations at the sacred cenote, for instance, have revealed the remains of about 200 individuals sacrificed over several centuries. That's a lot, but it's also a far cry from the exaggerated figures that suggest a conveyor belt of sacrifices. So, why the grandiose stories? Because exaggeration is human nature, and let's face it, fear sells. We also have to consider the economic engine driving these rituals. Sacrifices weren't just spiritual acts, they were social spectacles with political undertones. A well-executed ceremony could rally the populace, bolster the ruler's divine claim, and even intimidate neighboring city-states. These events required resources, elaborate costumes, ritual implements, even the logistics of gathering participants. It was a costly affair, and only the wealthiest cities could afford it regularly. And just like today's superpower displays, it was partly about sending a message. We're prosperous, we're powerful, and we're not afraid to show it. But what about the victims themselves? It wasn't always a case of unlucky lottery. Many were war captives, chosen as offerings precisely because of their status as outsiders or enemies. This wasn't just about appeasing the gods. It was about asserting dominance and reinforcing social hierarchies. And while it sounds brutal, in the context of the time, it was a strategic move. Sacrificing a high-status captive from a rival city-state was as much about political theater as it was about pleasing the divine. Now, a quick detour into the realm of belief systems. The Maya cosmos was a multidimensional affair, with gods who were as capricious as they were powerful. Sacrifices were, in essence, a form of communication, a dramatic telegram to the deities, ensuring they stayed on the good side of the cosmic ledger. And while we might balk at the idea, consider this. Every society has its rituals, its ways of reaching out to the divine or the unknown. The Maya just happened to take theirs a little more literally. But let's not forget the archaeological evidence that shapes our understanding. The Temple of the Warriors at Chichen Itza offers a treasure trove of insights. Murals and carvings depict scenes of sacrifice, but they also show us the broader context, celebrations, rituals, and the ebb and flow of daily life. It's a reminder that while sacrifices were a part of Maya culture, they were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The Maya had a rich tapestry of traditions, from art to astronomy, that coexisted with these darker elements. And here's the kicker. These practices, while grim by today's standards, were integral to Maya identity. They were woven into the very fabric of society, influencing everything from architecture to agriculture. The belief that human sacrifice could influence the gods was a potent motivator, driving the priesthood to maintain these traditions even in the face of changing political landscapes and economic pressures. So, while the sensational stories of Maya sacrifices capture the imagination, they're only part of the tale. The reality is a complex dance of belief, power, and survival, where each sacrifice was a calculated gamble to secure favor in a world where the divine could be as unpredictable as the weather. As we continue to unravel the layers of Maya history, remember that behind every myth lies a kernel of truth, a glimpse into the minds of a people who saw the universe as a stage and themselves as players in a cosmic drama. Stick around, because our journey through the Maya world is far from over. We've got more ground to cover, more myths to bust, and more mysteries to unravel. As we peel back the curtain on this ancient civilization, we find a story that's as much about us as it is about them. A story of humanity's unending quest to understand the forces that shape our world. So, buckle up, because the ride is just getting started. Now, let's dive into the nitty-gritty of Maya priesthood without a Hollywood filter. Forget the shimmering robes of fantasy. Let's talk real-world bling and the economic gears turning behind those ceremonial outfits. If you thought today's fashion industry was cutthroat, imagine being a Maya priest tasked with impressing both the gods and mortals. First up, obsidian blades. These weren't your average kitchen knives. They were the Swiss army knives of the ancient world, with edges sharper than a Twitter comeback. Sourced from volcanic regions like the highlands of Guatemala, obsidian was a hot commodity, literally and figuratively. The Maya didn't just stumble upon these volcanic glass shards. They had to trade and negotiate across long distances, creating a vast network that stretched as far as central Mexico. And it wasn't just about the blades. The craftsmanship involved in shaping these stones into ritual tools was a skill passed down through generations. We're talking about artisans who could make an obsidian blade finer than a surgeon's scalpel. These tools were essential for bloodletting rituals, making them as sacred as they were sharp. The priests wielded these blades with precision, turning every ceremony into a performance where every cut was both a religious act and a political statement. But let's not forget the ceremonial attire, because what's a ritual without some dramatic flair? Maya priests were decked out in textiles that would make a fashionista swoon. Their clothing was a riot of color, with intricate embroidery that told stories of gods and heroes. The materials, only the best. Cotton and woven fabrics dyed with rich hues from natural sources like indigo. These textiles were the product of an entire economy of weavers and dyers, each contributing to the spectacle that was a priestly procession. Feathered headdresses were the crowning glory, quite literally. Crafted from the plumage of exotic birds like quetzals and macaws, these headdresses were more than just eye candy. They were status symbols, marking the wearer as someone who had the ear of the gods, and the power that came with it. And let's not gloss over the logistics. Acquiring these feathers involved trade routes as intricate as any modern supply chain, stretching through dense jungles and over mountainous terrain. The trade networks that supported these religious items were as complex as the rituals they adorned. Picture bustling marketplaces where jade, shells, and textiles changed hands as frequently as gossip. The Maya economy was a tapestry of commerce, with traders acting as the lifeblood that kept the entire system running smoothly. Cities like Tikal and Capan were not just religious centers, but also bustling trade hubs, where priests could procure the necessary paraphernalia to ensure their ceremonies went off without a hitch. Now, let's decode the symbolism that made these tools and attire more than mere objects. Each item carried a weight of meaning, a language of symbols that communicated power and divine favor. Take the jaguar skin cloaks, for example. These weren't just for warmth or style. The jaguar was a potent symbol of the underworld and the spiritual power the priests claimed to channel. Wearing one was like donning a superhero cape imbued with cosmic significance. The symbols used by Maya priests were a masterclass in psychological manipulation, a way to speak directly to the fears and hopes of the populace. Glyphs and carvings adorned everything from temple walls to ritual implements, each telling a story or conveying a message. These symbols reinforced the divine right of rulers and the necessity of the priesthood, creating a narrative that was as hard to break as an obsidian blade. And here's a juicy tidbit. The priests weren't just using these symbols for show. They were also early adopters of what we'd now call branding. By aligning themselves with powerful symbols, they created an aura of authority that was as much about perception as it was about reality. It was a savvy move in a world where power often hinged on the stories you could tell and who believed them. But let's not romanticize too much. Behind every symbol and tool lay a stark reality, the need to control. The priests wielded their symbols like a conductor's baton, orchestrating society with a deft hand. In a culture where the divine and the mundane were intertwined, their power was as much about maintaining order as it was about spiritual guidance. So, in peeling back the layers of Maya priestly life, we find a world of craftsmanship and commerce, where rituals were as much a product of economic networks as they were of spiritual necessity. The priests were not just intermediaries between gods and men. They were the architects of a complex system that intertwined belief, politics, and trade. They were the original influencers, using every tool at their disposal to shape the world around them. And while we might balk at the idea of bloodletting and sacrifice, it's crucial to remember that these practices were part of a broader tapestry. They were acts of devotion, yes, but also of control. A reminder that in the Maya world, the difference between divine favor and earthly power was as thin as the edge of an obsidian blade. As we continue to explore the enigmatic world of the Maya, keep in mind that every ritual, every symbol, was a thread in the grand design of a civilization that thrived against the odds. The Maya priests, with their tools and symbols, were the weavers of this tapestry, crafting a story that continues to captivate us even today. And as we unravel more of their mysteries, we find not only a glimpse into their world, but reflections of our own, a reminder that the quest for power and understanding is as old as humanity itself. Stay tuned, because the next layer of this ancient saga is just waiting to be uncovered. And as we unravel more of their mysteries, we find not only a glimpse into their world, but reflections of our own, a reminder that the quest for power and understanding is as old as humanity itself. But what happens when a civilization so meticulously woven begins to unravel? That's the part of the Maya story we're diving into now, the decline of their rituals, and ultimately their civilization. First, let's set the stage. By the time the 9th century rolled around, the Maya world was a patchwork quilt of city-states, each with its own ruler, priesthood, and agenda. This was the classic setup for what you'd call too many cooks in the kitchen. The priests, who were once the linchpins of society, began to lose their grip. Why? Because the very systems they'd built were starting to buckle under their own weight. Cue the cosmic irony. Internally, the Maya were wrestling with issues that would send any civilization into a tailspin. Overpopulation was a ticking time bomb. Imagine cities like Tikal or Calakmul, bustling metropolises that at their peak housed tens of thousands of people, all clamoring for resources. When you've got too many mouths to feed, things can get a bit dicey. Add to this the fact that the agricultural systems, which had once been the envy of the ancient world, were starting to falter. Soil exhaustion, deforestation, and a series of severe droughts, each one more punishing than the last, turned fertile cropland into barren plots. It's like the gods themselves flipped the switch from bountiful to bare bones. Externally, the Maya were no strangers to conflict. Warfare was practically a cottage industry, with city-states constantly at each other's throats. But this wasn't just your run-of-the-mill skirmishing. This was warfare with a capital W. As resources dwindled, the stakes grew higher, and the conflicts more brutal. Alliances crumbled faster than a stale tortilla, and the once strong trade networks that fueled the economy began to fracture. The priests, who used to call the shots from the top of the temple, suddenly found themselves in a world where their rituals couldn't quite keep up with the demands of a society on the brink. Now, let's tackle the myth of the sudden collapse. The idea that the Maya civilization vanished overnight is about as misleading as calling a 10-day Netflix binge a quick break. The decline was a drawn-out affair, a slow bleed rather than a swift decapitation. Cities were abandoned, yes, but over the course of decades, even centuries, the great urban centers of the southern lowlands saw their populations dwindle as people migrated toward the northern Yucatan, where new cities like Chichen Itza rose to prominence. The Maya weren't disappearing. They were regrouping and adapting to new realities. And let's not forget the elephant in the room, the Spanish. By the time these bearded newcomers arrived in the 16th century, the Maya civilization had already undergone significant transformation. The priests, once the ultimate multitaskers, were dealing with a new set of challenges. The Spanish conquest added another layer of complexity, with its own brand of religious fervor and political maneuvering. The Maya, who had spent centuries perfecting the art of negotiation with the divine, found themselves facing a different kind of force, one that came with gunpowder and smallpox. So what's the legacy of the Maya priests and their rituals? For one, they've left us with a treasure trove of archaeological wonders. The ruins of cities like Palenque, Capan, and Tikal stand as testaments to the ingenuity and ambition of a civilization that reached for the stars. These sites continue to captivate tourists and scholars alike, offering clues to the past and fueling our imaginations about what once was. In modern culture, the mystique of the Maya priests endures. They are the stars of documentaries, feature films, and even video games, though often with a Hollywood sheen that leaves out the less glamorous realities. The allure of their rituals, with all their blood-soaked drama, is the stuff of legends, and who doesn't love a good legend? But it's essential to remember the human side of this story, a civilization striving to maintain balance in a world that was anything but stable. From an academic perspective, the study of Maya rituals provides invaluable insights into human behavior and societal evolution. The intricacies of their calendars, the sophistication of their mathematics, and the sheer audacity of their monumental architecture continue to inspire awe and respect. They remind us that while the Maya civilization may have declined, it didn't vanish without a trace. Its echoes linger in the fields of anthropology, archaeology, and history, challenging us to learn from both their triumphs and their failures. So, as you tuck into bed tonight, think of the Maya priests as more than just enigmatic figures from a distant past. They were real people navigating a world of upheaval and uncertainty, much like us today. Their story is a poignant reminder that civilizations rise and fall, but the human spirit endures, ever curious, ever striving. And as we sift through the sands of time, we glean not just the remnants of a bygone era, but also the enduring quest for meaning and mastery over the mysteries of our universe. Sleep tight, with dreams of ancient wonders, and the knowledge that history, with all its grandeur and grit, is far from a closed book. The rooster's crow is practically a war cry, jolting you awake. Welcome to another day in the Han Dynasty. It's dawn, but no time for sleepy eyes. You're about to dive headfirst into the world of ancient Chinese bureaucracy. Spoiler, it's not exactly a 9-to-5 gig with coffee breaks. Your first task: survive the ultimate job interview, the civil service exams. Forget LinkedIn. This is where Confucius meets survival of the fittest, with a side of scroll reading that makes a lawyer's briefcase look like light reading. Picture this, though not too vividly, because you're about to be one of 30,000 hopefuls, all vying for a few dozen positions. That's right, 30,000. That's not a job market. That's a lottery with worse odds than winning a free dumpling. The Han Dynasty's civil service exam wasn't just a test. It was a 3-day marathon where your mental stamina was tested as much as your bladder control. Seriously, the exam was so intense, they provided chamber parts, and you thought standardized testing was rough. The goal: to prove that you have what it takes to run the empire, or at least to shuffle some documents around while quoting Confucius like a sage with a degree in philosophy and a minor in penmanship. So why all the fuss over a few government jobs? Because this was your ticket to the big time. The Han Dynasty, reigning from 206 BCE to 220 CE, was the golden age of Chinese civilization. It was like the Renaissance, but with more silk and fewer sculptures of naked people. The government was a well-oiled machine, or at least a machine that required a lot of oiling, and it needed bureaucrats to keep things moving. If you could snag a position, you weren't just part of the system, you were the system. But back to you and your exam ordeal. The exam room, if you can call it that, is more of an arena. You're surrounded by hopefuls, all of whom have spent years preparing. Some probably started studying before they knew how to hold a brush. And you thought your SAT cram sessions were intense. You're here to prove your mastery of the 5 classics, the cornerstone of Confucian education. We're talking poetry, history, rights, and more philosophy than a freshman seminar. It's not just about knowing the texts, it's about embodying them. You need to be Confucius, channeling his wisdom while keeping your calligraphy on point. And let's be honest, calligraphy is the OG of fine motor skills. The examiners aren't just looking for answers, they're looking for style. Your brushstrokes must flow like the Yellow River, not sputter like a clogged aqueduct. Why such an intense process? Because the Han emperors believed, rightly or wrongly, that the key to a stable empire was a bureaucracy informed by Confucian ideals. This wasn't just about plugging a few numbers into an abacus. It was about upholding values like loyalty, integrity, and filial piety. If you couldn't quote the right analects at the right time, you might as well pack your bags and head back to the rice paddies. But let's not romanticize too much. The reality was that many of these exam hopefuls were from elite backgrounds. Sure, the myth says anyone could rise to the top, but when you're competing against the well-connected sons of ministers, the playing field isn't exactly level. It's like the Ivy League of ancient China, except your tuition is paid in sleepless nights and ink stains. As you settle into your exam cubicle, yes, cubicles are apparently as old as bureaucracy itself, you feel the weight of history pressing on your shoulders. No pressure, but this is your chance to escape the grind of ordinary life. Or, to find yourself as a footnote in history, one of thousands who tried and failed. By midday, you're knee-deep in classical Chinese. Your brush moves with mechanical precision, but inside, your brain is doing cartwheels, trying to remember the exact phrasing of a Confucian verse. Meanwhile, the guy next to you seems to be writing a novel. You hope he's just overcompensating, but you can't help feeling a twinge of envy, or maybe it's just hunger. 3 days of mental gymnastics require more than rice and tea. As the sun begins its descent, casting long shadows across the exam hall, you ponder the absurdity of it all. Why put yourself through this? Because, in the Han Dynasty, this was the path to power. Yet, the irony isn't lost on you. The very system designed to find the best and brightest often favored those with the means to prepare. It's a tale as old as time, where meritocracy meets reality, and reality usually wins. As you lay down your brush at the end of this grueling day, you realize that even if you don't make it, you're part of a grand tradition. A tradition that values knowledge and virtue, if not always in equal measure. You might not be the next grand historian or imperial advisor, but at least you have a story to tell, and that's worth a scroll or two. As you lay down your brush at the end of this grueling day, you realize that even if you don't make it, you're part of a grand tradition. A tradition that values knowledge and virtue, if not always in equal measure. You might not be the next grand historian or imperial advisor, but at least you have a story to tell, and that's worth a scroll or two. And speaking of scrolls, let's talk about where all those tales of bureaucratic valor and valorous bureaucracy end up, the labyrinthine offices of the Han administration. Now, don't let your modern-day office nightmares fool you. Forget about your ergonomic chairs and standing desks. Here in the Han Dynasty, we're dealing with the original paper trail, except it's not paper, it's bamboo. Picture entire rooms filled with bamboo strips strung together, the ancient equivalent of a filing cabinet. You think your email inbox is overwhelming. Try navigating through scrolls that could wrap around the Great Wall. Twice. You see, running an empire of over 57 million souls wasn't just about making grand proclamations from the throne. It required a small army of scribes, clerks, and officials to keep every cog in the machine greased and turning. This was bureaucracy on steroids. Every decision, every decree, every tax record was meticulously documented. In a world without Control plus F, finding a misplaced scroll could take longer than building the thing in the first place. So, what's a day like in the life of a Han bureaucrat? Well, first off, forget the idea of coming in at 9 a.m. and clocking out at 5 p.m. This is a lifestyle, not a job. You start your day before the rooster has even considered crowing, and you don't stop until the stars are out. Coffee breaks, more like tea sips between stacks of work that never seem to diminish. Let's debunk a popular myth while we're at it, the notion of the Han bureaucracy as a pure meritocracy. Sure, the civil service exams were the stuff of legends, but if you think family connections were irrelevant, I've got a bamboo bridge to sell you. While the exams were an intellectual gauntlet, the harsh truth is that your chances of getting one of those coveted positions were significantly boosted if you had the right last name. The Han Dynasty was like a giant game of who you know, where networking events were family dinners and nepotism was just another day at the office. Despite the myth of anyone climbing the social ladder through sheer intellect and dedication, the reality was a bit more exclusive. The imperial court was an intricate tapestry of familial alliances and patronage networks. This is where the well-to-do really shined, with access to the best tutors and the luxury of study time that wasn't interrupted by mundane concerns like, staying alive. And yet, the allure of rising through the ranks remained strong. Who wouldn't want to trade the rustic life for a chance to influence policy and rub shoulders with the empire's elite? The bureaucracy was the backbone of the Han Dynasty, ensuring that taxes flowed, laws were obeyed, and the emperor's will was done. But it was also a beast that needed constant feeding, with a voracious appetite for detail and precision. In the halls of power, the work might have been as thrilling as watching ink dry, but its impact was monumental. These were the folks who kept the empire's complex tax and legal systems running smoothly. With a population explosion and an expanding territory, the need for a robust system of governance was more crucial than ever. Yet, in this world of endless scrolls and ink pots, the human element was never far behind. Mistakes were made, power plays ensued, and sometimes the system that was meant to be impartial and just was anything but. So, next time you're staring down a mountain of paperwork, take heart in knowing that you're not alone. Your ancient counterparts were right there with you, battling the same bureaucratic demons. Only they did it in robes, with bamboo scrolls, and a Confucian compass guiding their every move. It's a wonder they didn't just throw their brushes in the air and walk out. But then, Who would keep the wheels of the empire turning? As the morning sun climbs higher and the hustle of the Han office grows louder, you find yourself caught in a symphony of quills scratching against bamboo. Each stroke is a testament to the sprawling organism that is the Han bureaucracy. And while the system was far from perfect, it was a marvel of its time. A grand, sprawling, and occasionally dysfunctional marvel. Yes, but a marvel nonetheless. And in this intricate dance of ink and intellect, one can't help but wonder if the allure of the bureaucracy lay not just in the power it promised, but in the stories that unfolded within its walls. Stories of ambition, of triumphs and failures, of corruption and reform. Stories that, much like the scrolls themselves, were destined to outlive their creators. And as those stories of ambition and reform echo in your mind, you find yourself thrust into the unromantic, grueling world of the Han Dynasty's tax collection. You might think taxes are just numbers on a ledger, but in the Han era, collecting grain tax was more like an epic saga of travel, negotiation, and the occasional moral compromise. Picture this. You're no longer in the cozy confines of the office, but out on the rugged roads of rural China, bouncing along in a wooden cart, with the wind more of an enemy than a companion. The Han Empire was vast, spanning over 6 million square kilometers at its peak, and tax collectors had to cover a lot of ground. Forget about GPS. You're armed with little more than a map that looks like it was drawn by a toddler with a brush. The average farmer, who you're tasked with taxing, isn't exactly rolling in riches. With over 80% of the population living in rural areas, these folks are the backbone of the empire, but they're often one bad harvest away from ruin. Enter you, the tax collector, demanding their hard-earned grain, up to 1/10 of their harvest. It's a tough gig, and you're about as welcome as a rat in a rice barn. Your job is to ensure the emperor's coffers are filled, but it's less about crunching numbers, and more about playing diplomat, psychologist, and dare we say it, opportunist. With no digital records to back you up, you're relying on trust and intuition. And let's be honest, sometimes the quickest way to a farmer's heart and granary is through a well-placed bribe. Call it a facilitation fee if you will, because in this world of bamboo scrolls and Confucian ideals, greasing the wheels was as essential as the wheels themselves. The reality of these economic pressures paints a stark picture. The Han Dynasty's economic policies were like a high-wire act without a safety net. Sure, they were groundbreaking. After all, this was the era that saw the introduction of state monopolies on iron and salt, the establishment of a standardized currency, and the expansion of the Silk Road. But these innovations also placed a heavy burden on the common folk, who were expected to shoulder the empire's grand ambitions. Now, let's debunk another myth while we're at it. The romantic image of the benevolent tax collector, a wise old sage in Confucian robes, is a lovely tale, but reality was often much grittier. Many tax collectors were seen as corrupt opportunists, lining their pockets while the farmers struggled. And who could blame them? With the stakes so high and the oversight so low, the system was ripe for exploitation. The Han government tried to keep things in check by sending inspectors to ensure taxes were collected fairly. But surprise, surprise, not every inspector was above taking a little something under the table. The system was far from perfect, and while it kept the empire running, it also bred resentment and rebellion. In fact, tax grievances were a major factor, leading to the Yellow Turban Rebellion in 184 CE, a peasant uprising that rocked the dynasty to its core. So here you are, standing in a field, negotiating with a farmer who's eyeing you like you just insulted his ancestors. It's a delicate dance of power and persuasion, where the stakes are as high as the mountains surrounding you. And as you collect the grain, your cart slowly filling with the fruits of someone else's labor, you can't help but feel the weight of the empire's expectations pressing down on your shoulders. By noon, you visited a dozen farms, each with its own set of challenges. Some farmers are cooperative, offering their grain with a resigned shrug, while others are defiant, demanding to know why they should give up their hard-earned harvest. You try to explain that their grain feeds the soldiers who protect their land, maintains the roads they travel, and supports the bureaucracy that, in theory, keeps order. But deep down, you know it's a hard sell when their stomachs are as empty as their granaries. As you journey from village to village, you can't help but marvel at the sheer scale of the Han economy. This was a time when China was a global superpower, trading silk, spices, and precious metals with distant lands. The Silk Road was more than a trade route. It was the ancient equivalent of the internet, connecting cultures and economies in a web of commerce and communication. Yet, for all its grandeur, the empire's prosperity was built on the backs of its farmers, who toiled in obscurity to keep the wheels of commerce turning. In the grand scheme of things, your role as a tax collector is a small but essential cog in this vast machine. You are part of a system that is both ingenious and flawed, a testament to human ingenuity and the harsh realities of power. And as you watch the sun begin its slow descent, casting long shadows across the fields, you realize that, much like the Empire's fortunes, your day is far from over. Your cart creaks under the weight of grain as you make your way back to the local magistrate's office, where the day's collections will be tallied and recorded. You know that every grain you deliver is a thread in the tapestry of the Han Dynasty, a testament to the Empire's reach and ambition. But as you hand over your haul, you can't shake the feeling that you're also part of a story far greater than yourself, a story of power, perseverance, and the eternal struggle between idealism and reality. And so, as the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, you find yourself reflecting on the day's events. The life of a hand tax collector is a far cry from the romanticized tales of noble bureaucrats and enlightened governance. It's a gritty, challenging existence, filled with moral dilemmas and hard choices. Yet, despite the hardships, there's a certain allure to it all, a sense of purpose and connection to something larger than yourself. As you lay down your head, exhausted but satisfied, you can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring. Will it be another day of negotiations and bribes, or will you find yourself in the midst of a rebellion, facing down angry farmers with nothing to lose? Only time will tell. But one thing is certain. In the Han Dynasty, the only constant is change, and the stories of ambition and reform continue to unfold, shaping the Empire's destiny, and yours along with it. As the stars twinkle above, the real drama of the Han Dynasty is just warming up. Forget the daytime grind of tax collection. The real action is happening in the shadowy corridors of power, where ambition and betrayal play out like a Shakespearean tragedy, minus the iambic pentameter. Welcome to the imperial court, where politics is a blood sport, and even a misplaced glance could set off a chain reaction of chaos. If you thought your office politics were bad, wait until you meet the players in this high-stakes game. We're talking eunuchs, empresses, and imperial relatives, all jockeying for influence over an empire that stretched farther than a marathon runner's patience. First, let's talk eunuchs. These weren't just palace servants with unfortunate fates, or power brokers with the emperor's ear, wielding influence like a double-edged sword. In a world where family ties could be both a blessing and a curse, eunuchs had the advantage of being unattached and thus, theoretically, impartial. But let's be real, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Case in point, Zhang Rang, the leader of the infamous 10 Eunuchs, a group that effectively ran the show during the latter Han period. They weren't just gatekeepers, they were kingmakers. Imagine a boardroom filled with people who could fire you on a whim, except here, the stakes were your life, not your promotion. And then there's the imperial family itself. If you think your family gatherings are tense, imagine having an empress who could command armies with a simple nod. Empress Lu, for example, was more than just the emperor's wife. She was a political strategist who held the reins of power long after her husband's death. She didn't just navigate the treacherous waters of court politics, she practically invented the map. Her reign saw the elimination of rival clans and the consolidation of power, all while maintaining a veneer of Confucian propriety. Talk about multitasking. But how did these backdoor dealings affect our beleaguered bureaucrat? Well, in a word, severely. Imagine being a mid-level official caught in the crossfire of these titanic power struggles. Your career could soar or crash based on whose favor you curried. One well-placed rumor could be the difference between a cushy post in the capital and a miserable exile to the hinterlands. The court was less a place of governance and more a pressure cooker of ambition and paranoia. This political theater wasn't just for show. It had real consequences. The Han Dynasty's reliance on eunuchs and family members to fill high-ranking positions often led to corruption and inefficiency. It's the age-old tale. When the fox guards the henhouse, you can expect some missing chickens. Despite the Confucian ideal of a meritocratic bureaucracy, the reality was that personal connections often trumped talent. It was like trying to win a game of chess where the rules changed depending on who was in charge. Speaking of rules, let's not forget the role of court historians. These were the folks who chronicled events, shaping the narrative for future generations. But even here, bias and political maneuvering were the name of the game. C. Mackay, the grand historian, famously chronicled the early Han period, but not without paying a hefty price for displeasing the emperor. His work, Records of the Grand Historian, was both a masterpiece and a cautionary tale about the perils of speaking truth to power. Now, you might be wondering why anyone would willingly step into this snake pit. The answer is simple: power. The allure of shaping an empire's destiny was a siren call few could resist. And let's face it, the benefits were nothing to sneeze at. A successful career could mean wealth, status, and the kind of legacy that outlasts even the most durable bamboo scroll. Yet, for every official who navigated the treacherous waters of court politics, there were dozens who found themselves shipwrecked on the rocks of ambition. It was a world where alliances were as fragile as the paper they were written on. One day you're on top, the next you're yesterday's news, or worse, today's scandal. As the afternoon sun dips below the horizon, casting long shadows over the imperial palace, you realize that in this world, nothing is what it seems. It's a theater of ambition where the players are as complex as the plot lines they weave. And behind every grand proclamation and public display, there's a web of intrigue that would make even the most seasoned diplomat break out in a cold sweat. So, as you tuck away another day of bureaucratic drama and court intrigue, take solace in the fact that while the Han Dynasty might be an ancient tale, its lessons are timeless. Power, ambition, and the human penchant for drama, these are constants in the grand tapestry of history. And as the curtain falls on another act, you can't help but wonder what tomorrow will bring. Whatever it is, one thing's for sure. In this game, the stakes are always high, and the players never sleep. And as the night deepens, we leave these corridors of power for now, knowing that the next chapter will bring new players, new intrigues, and perhaps even a twist or two. Because in the Han Dynasty, the only certainty is uncertainty, and the stories of ambition and reform are as endless as the stars in the sky. As the stars in the Han Dynasty's sky twinkle like 1,000 tiny bureaucratic tasks waiting to be completed, you find yourself reflecting on the whirlwind of a day you've just survived. It was a day where ambition wrestled with reality, and where the grandeur of governance came face to face with the gritty details of administration. You're elbow-deep in bamboo scrolls and political machinations, yet somehow the allure of power is more intoxicating than the finest rice wine. The Han bureaucracy, sprawling and intricate, was like a living organism, constantly evolving and adapting to the needs of an empire that, at its height, ruled over 57 million people. This was no small feat, especially when you consider that the entire Roman Empire at the same time was roughly comparable in population. The Han Dynasty's administration was a marvel of efficiency, and at times, inefficiency. It was the original paradox, a system designed to be both rigid and flexible, depending on the whims of whoever held the reins. But let's peel back the layers of this ancient onion. The civil service exams, that grueling rite of passage, were a stark reminder that in the Han Dynasty, knowledge was power, and power was everything. Sure, the romantic notion of a meritocratic system where even the lowliest peasant could rise to high office is appealing. But much like the idea that bamboo scrolls were a sensible filing system, it's more myth than reality. The exams were indeed open to all, but the truth is, without the right connections, or a family willing to support years of study, your chances of success were about as high as finding a friendly eunuch in the imperial court. And what of those who succeeded? The lucky few who managed to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of power and influence. They were the architects of an empire that would leave a lasting legacy. Han Dynasty's bureaucratic system laid the groundwork for what would become the civil service system of later Chinese dynasties, and even today, echoes of it can be found in modern governance structures around the world. The ideal of selecting leaders based on ability rather than birth is a testament to the enduring influence of this ancient institution. Yet, for all its achievements, the system was far from perfect. It was a world where favoritism often trumped fairness, and where corruption was as common as tea. The infamous eunuchs, with their unchecked power, were the embodiment of this flaw. They wielded influence in ways that would make even the most seasoned political operator blush. And while their tales of intrigue and manipulation make for thrilling stories, they also highlight a fundamental truth about power. It corrupts and is seldom wielded without consequence. As you mull over these thoughts, it's impossible not to draw parallels to the present. The idea of a bureaucratic system run amok, with power concentrated in the hands of a few, is not just a relic of the past. It's a cautionary tale that resonates even today. The Han Dynasty's bureaucracy was a mirror to human nature, reflecting both our capacity for greatness and our propensity for greed. But let's not get too bogged down in the gloom. For all its flaws, the Han bureaucracy was a remarkable achievement. It kept an empire running for over 4 centuries, a feat that few other civilizations have matched. This was a time when roads were built, trade flourished, and culture thrived. The Silk Road opened up new avenues of commerce and exchange, connecting east and west in a web of economic and cultural interactions that would shape the world for centuries to come. So, as you sit back and reflect on the day, take solace in the fact that while the Han Dynasty may be ancient history, its lessons are timeless. It's a reminder that governance is a balancing act, one that requires constant attention and adjustment. The stories of ambition and reform that played out in its hallowed halls are not just tales of the past, they are a blueprint for the future. And as you finally step back into your own time, there's a certain satisfaction in knowing that while the bureaucracy may have been a beast to navigate, at least you can do it with a cup of decent coffee in hand. Because if there's one thing the Han Dynasty could have improved upon, it's the quality of its caffeinated beverages. So here's to you, intrepid traveler of time and bureaucracy. May your future endeavors be as enlightening as your journey through the past. You're standing on the banks of the Nile, and let me tell you, this is where the magic happens. No, not the abracadabra kind, but the kind of magic that built civilizations. The Nile isn't just a river, it's the ancient Egyptian version of the internet, connecting, supporting, and occasionally driving you mad with its unpredictability. Today, it promises another day of hard work. But before you start grumbling about Mondays, remember that without the Nile, Egypt might have been just another patch of desert wandering where all the good times went. Now, let's talk about what's floating your boat today, literally. Ancient Egyptian ships are the unsung heroes of this sprawling civilization. Forget those romantic depictions of sleek vessels with golden sails slicing through the water like a heart knife through butter. The reality was more like a butter knife through a brick of ice. These ships were built from acacia wood and papyrus reeds, materials that aren't exactly known for their luxurious finish. Acacia wood was durable, sure, but it was also about as flexible as a grumpy cat. Papyrus, on the other hand, was lightweight and abundant, but good luck convincing it to do more than float aimlessly. You're probably picturing a grand fleet of ships, each a masterpiece of ancient engineering. Well, let's burst that bubble with a satisfying pop. The typical Egyptian vessel was about 20 meters long and 5 meters wide. Not exactly a cruise ship, but it gets the job done. These boats were more about function than form, designed to carry cargo like grain, beer, and occasionally a pharaoh or two. They were the ancient equivalent of those massive trucks you see on highways, and much like those, they weren't built for speed. They crawled along at a pace that made snails look like Olympic sprinters. But hey, at least they were reliable. Speaking of reliability, let's dive into the mechanics of these floating wonders. You've got a central mast with a square sail, which sounds straightforward, until you realize that steering one of these bad boys was a bit like trying to herd cats. The rudder, often just an oversized paddle, required a crew with the patience of saints and muscles like Hercules. Oh, and the sail. It's made from linen, which works great until you hit a snag. Literally. But don't worry, you've got a team of sailors who can patch that up quicker than you can say, Osiris. Now, why go through all this trouble? What's the point of putting up with splinters, sunburns, and the constant threat of capsizing? The answer, as usual, is money, and lots of it. The Nile was the main artery of trade routes that stretched far and wide. Egyptian ships weren't just floating cargo boxes. They were lifelines connecting bustling markets from Nubia in the south to the Mediterranean in the north. Gold, papyrus, linen, and grain flowed through these waters, bringing wealth and prosperity. It's a bit like ancient Amazon Prime, but with fewer drones and more crocodiles. And here's where things get really interesting. All this trade wasn't just about stacking gold in Pharaoh's coffers. It was about power and politics, too. Control the Nile, and you control the heart of Egypt. It was a Game of Thrones with a wet twist. The pharaohs knew this, which is why they invested heavily in their navy. Not just any navy, mind you, but a fleet that could both defend and attack. These ships were the unsung heroes of military campaigns, ensuring that Egypt's influence stretched far beyond the riverbanks. But let's not get carried away with tales of glory. The life of an Egyptian sailor was anything but glamorous. Long hours, unpredictable weather, and the constant threat of enemy attacks made every voyage an adventure, or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. On top of that, maintenance was a never-ending chore. Wood rots, ropes fray, and sails tear. Forget about leisurely days on deck sipping wine. It's all hands on deck, all the time. As you stand there watching the sun rise and cast a golden glow over the Nile, take a moment to appreciate the reality behind the romantic myths. These ships weren't just vessels. They were a testament to human ingenuity and determination. They were the backbone of a civilization that thrived in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. So, next time you hear about the grandeur of ancient Egypt, remember the humble ships that made it all possible. And maybe tip your hat to the sailors who braved the waters, one weary stroke at a time. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its relentless rays onto the Nile, the real work began. The morning calm was the calm before the storm of activity that defined midday on an Egyptian ship. You see, sailing downstream wasn't just a matter of letting the current do the work. Oh no, it required a choreography as precise as any royal dance, with every member of the crew playing a crucial part in keeping this wooden leviathan afloat and on course. Let's talk hierarchies. Forget about the egalitarian daydreams of everyone pulling a rope in perfect harmony. These ships were microcosms of Egyptian society, complete with their own pecking order. At the top, you had the captain, or the Heka, which literally means ruler. Think of him as the pharaoh of the floating kingdom, except with less bling and more responsibility. He wasn't just steering the ship, he was steering the lives of everyone on board. A few misjudged commands, and you could end up with a mutinous crew or worse, a sunken ship. Below the captain were the officers, a group of seasoned sailors who probably knew the Nile like the back of their calloused hands. They were the middle management, ensuring that orders from above were executed without a hitch. Then came the sailors, the backbone of the operation. These guys were the real workhorses, the ones with blisters on their palms and salt crusted into their hair. Their job was to haul ropes, steer rudders, and patch sails faster than you could say Tutankhamun's tomb. They were the unsung heroes, grinding away in the sun, their pay often in grain or other goods rather than shiny coins. And let's not forget the oarsmen. These were typically the lower class or even slaves, tasked with the grueling work of rowing against the current or in windless conditions. Their muscles were their currency, and every stroke was a step closer to exhaustion. Life on the river was tough, but for many, it was a step up from toiling in the fields under the watchful eye of a landowner. Plus, there was always the allure of adventure, of leaving behind the familiar sands and seeing what lay beyond the horizon. Ah, trade, the lifeblood of these watery highways. You could say it was the original stimulus package, fueling the Egyptian economy in ways that would make any modern economist nod in approval. Ships weren't just carrying grain and beer. They were laden with copper from the Sinai, gold and incense from Nubia, and cedar from Lebanon. These raw materials were the building blocks of empire, transforming into statues, temples, and the very coffins that carried pharaohs into the afterlife. And then there were the luxury goods, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, ebony and ivory from farther south in Africa, and glass from the Levant. These were the items that dazzled in the royal courts, symbols of wealth and power that were as much about showing off as they were about actual utility. A pharaoh's prestige was often measured not just in territorial control, but in the exotic treasures he could amass. It was a game of one-upmanship played on a grand scale, with the Nile as the board and ships as the pawns. Now, how did they navigate this vast network without the aid of modern technology? No GPS, no compasses, just the sun, stars, and a lot of educated guesses. During the day, the sun was the guide, rising in the east and setting in the west, a dependable constant in a world that could be as unpredictable as the river itself. By night, the stars were the mariner's map, constellations like Orion and the Big Dipper acting as celestial signposts. But let's not romanticize this too much. Navigation was as much an art as a science, often relying on the collective memory of seasoned sailors who could read the subtle cues of the river and sky. It wasn't uncommon for ships to get lost or run aground, their cargo and crew at the mercy of the elements. Yet, the Egyptians were nothing if not resilient, adapting and learning from every mishap, every misstep. As the day wore on, the rhythms of life aboard the ship continued, each task a small cog in the greater machine of Egyptian dominance. It was a testament to human ingenuity and determination, a daily dance of survival that played out on the sunlit waters of the Nile. And as you stand there, watching the organized chaos unfold, take a moment to appreciate the unsung orchestras of history, the men and women who, against all odds, kept the lifeblood of a civilization flowing. As the afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, the life aboard the Nile's ships marched on with the kind of rigor you'd expect from a well-oiled bureaucratic machine. And if you thought the Egyptians were just about pyramids and mummies, think again. Their administrative prowess on water was as impressive as any sarcophagus. So, let's dive into the bureaucratic beast that kept these maritime ventures afloat. Say hello to the scribes, the unsung paper pushers of ancient Egypt. Imagine them as the ancient equivalent of your favorite spreadsheet wizard, only with a lot more papyrus and much less Excel. These guys were the record keepers, ensuring that every grain of wheat, every amphora of beer, and every sack of gold dust was accounted for. They were the human hard drives of their time, storing data with the kind of precision that would make even the most obsessive accountant blush. But why all this fuss over record keeping? Well, control the books, control the wealth. The Nile wasn't just a river, it was a highway of commerce, and the pharaohs knew that keeping tabs on every transaction was key to maintaining their grip on power. The scribes were the guardians of this economic lifeline, tallying goods with a diligence that ensured no shekel went untracked. It was a system as watertight as the hulls they sailed on, or at least as watertight as a boat made of reeds and acacia could be. And then there were the tax collectors. The taxman, an institution as old as civilization itself. These folks were the pharaoh's financial enforcers, ensuring that every trader who dared to ply the Nile paid their dues. It wasn't just about collecting revenue. It was about asserting the state's dominance over this watery realm. The tolls and taxes extracted from merchants were the grease that turned the wheels of the Egyptian economy, funding everything from monumental building projects to military campaigns. Speaking of funding, let's talk about the cost of keeping this fleet afloat. Building a ship in ancient Egypt wasn't as simple as hitting order on Amazon. It required resources, manpower, and a whole lot of elbow grease. A typical vessel could set you back around 20 deben of copper, a hefty sum when you consider that a deben was roughly 91 grams of metal. And that's not even counting the cost of maintenance, which was an ongoing affair. Wood rotted, sails tore, and ropes frayed, requiring constant attention and resources just to keep things shipshape. Then there's the crew. These weren't volunteers cheerfully singing sea shanties. They were laborers who expected compensation for their troubles, often in the form of food, clothing, or other goods. Salaries were more about survival than luxury, with payments often reflecting the harsh realities of their work. A sailor might earn enough to keep his family fed, but he wasn't exactly rolling in riches. It was a life of hard work and harder conditions, with little room for complaint. And let's not forget the less glamorous aspects of river life. While you're picturing a gentle cruise down the Nile, reality had other plans. The river was home to an impressive array of hazards, not least of which were the crocodiles. These ancient predators were the real kings of the Nile, lurking beneath the surface and reminding sailors that in this river they weren't always at the top of the food chain. And if the crocs didn't get you, the weather might. Sudden storms could whip up waves with the force of an angry deity, testing the mettle of even the most experienced crews. But for all the dangers and discomforts, there was something undeniably romantic about life on the Nile. It was a frontier, a place where the familiar met the unknown, where every bend in the river could reveal new opportunities or new threats. The sailors of ancient Egypt weren't just participants in a grand economic machine. They were adventurers, explorers charting the course of history one stroke at a time. Yet, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows on the water, it was clear that the true power of the Nile lay not just in its ability to connect people and places, but in the intricate web of human endeavor that it supported. From the scribes to the sailors, each played a vital role in a system that was as complex as it was ancient. And as you stand on the banks of this mighty river, it's worth considering the legacy of those who navigated its waters, their stories etched into the very fabric of Egyptian civilization. So, while we bask in the romantic allure of Egypt's golden age, it's crucial to remember the grit that underpinned it all. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was a classroom, a battleground, and a lifeline. And as the day draws to a close, the lessons it taught remain as relevant as ever. That progress is born from perseverance, and that the true measure of a civilization lies not in its monuments, but in the spirit of its people. As the sun begins its lazy descent, painting the Nile in hues of burnt orange and gold, it's time to delve into the loopy world of ancient Egyptian spirituality, where boats weren't just about getting from point A to point B. Oh no, these water taxis had celestial ambitions. It's like if your Uber doubled as a time machine to the afterlife. Let's start with the basics. For the ancient Egyptians, the Nile wasn't just a river. It was the lifeblood of both their earthly existence and their spiritual beliefs. Imagine a holy highway, a divine freeway, where the mundane met the metaphysical. It was as if the Nile flowed through both time and space, connecting the living with the immortal realms of the gods. And in this mythical commute, boats played a starring role. Take the solar bark, for instance. This wasn't your average day sailor. According to Egyptian mythology, the sun god Ra traveled across the sky in a fiery chariot by day and cruised through the underworld by night in his celestial boat, the bark of millions of years. That's right. He clocked in more frequent flyer miles than any mortal could dream of, all while battling chaos and ensuring the sun rose each morning. Talk about a work-life balance. Now, for the Egyptians, this wasn't just a bedtime story. It was cosmic truth. They believed that by mimicking the gods, they too could secure a smooth passage to the afterlife. Because what's the point of living in an eternal paradise if you can't arrive there in style, right? Hence, the inclusion of boat models in tombs. These diminutive vessels weren't just for show. They were spiritual insurance policies, ensuring the deceased would sail seamlessly into the afterlife. It's the ancient equivalent of tossing a kayak into your grave, just in case you need a lift in the great beyond. But let's not stop at models. The Egyptians took their nautical afterlife prep to the extreme with full-sized boats. Consider the Khufu ship, an actual vessel buried next to the Great Pyramid of Giza around 2500 BCE. This bad boy was 43, 6 meters long, built from Lebanon cedar, and intended to ferry the pharaoh to eternity. It's like burying a Ferrari with a billionaire, only with more splinters. Boats also turned up in inscriptions and art, where they weren't just depicted as practical tools, but as symbols of power, prestige, and divine favor. They showed up on temple walls, in papyri, and on the very stones of pyramids. These images weren't just decorative, they were declarations of faith and status. It's the ancient equivalent of a social media profile pic, but with a lot more hieroglyphics and a dash of cosmic significance. On a more everyday level, boats were central to religious festivals, too. The god Osiris, associated with the afterlife, was celebrated with a boat procession during the annual Wepet Renpit festival. Picture this, a fleet of boats carrying statues of deities, gliding along the Nile amidst hymns and offerings, a divine parade with more pageantry than a royal wedding. It was a reminder to the living of the divine powers that guided their world and their place within it. But let's not get too misty-eyed. For all the romance of spiritual symbolism, the reality was that these beliefs were deeply entwined with the political and social fabric of Egypt. The pharaohs used these religious narratives to bolster their divine right to rule. By claiming a direct link to deities like Ra and Osiris, they weren't just leaders, they were god kings, with authority that reached beyond mere mortal concerns. It's a power play wrapped in a spiritual package, and it worked brilliantly. On a more personal level, the promise of an afterlife journey wasn't just for royalty. Even common folk aspired to a celestial cruise, albeit on a more modest vessel. Tombs of the elite often contained small wooden models of boats, complete with miniature crews, to ensure that the deceased had everything they needed for their journey. It's like ancient insurance against spiritual FOMO, fear of missing out. Now, as the twilight deepens and the sounds of the Nile quiet down, it's worth reflecting on what this all meant for the average Egyptian. The river wasn't just a source of water and transport. It was a spiritual artery, carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire civilization. It was both the literal and symbolic lifeline, a conduit between worlds, where the mundane and the mythical flowed together. So, as you stand there, watching the last light dance on the water, consider the dual nature of these ancient vessels. They were both practical tools and powerful symbols, representing a civilization that understood the importance of both the earthly and the divine. Boats were their bridges to the gods, their vehicles to the afterlife, and their testimonies to human ingenuity. As the night envelops the Nile, it leaves us pondering the vastness of Egyptian spirituality and its maritime manifestations. This is not a conclusion, dear friend, but merely a pause, a breath taken before we dive back into the complex, awe-inspiring tapestry of history, where each thread tells a story of belief, power, and the eternal quest for meaning. And now, as the shadows deepen and the cool night air settles over the Nile, let's chart one last voyage, a journey into the legacy of ancient Egyptian sailing. You see, the ripples caused by these early maritime practices have extended far beyond the banks of the Nile, influencing civilizations that stretched well beyond the deserts of Egypt. To start, consider the very idea of the Nile as a transportation wonderland, a concept that later civilizations would borrow and adapt. The ancient Egyptians pioneered a system of riverine navigation that was nothing short of revolutionary, given the tools at hand. Their mastery of the Nile laid the groundwork for the Greeks and Romans, who would later dominate the Mediterranean with fleets inspired by those early Egyptian designs. Ships crafted from the lessons of the Nile would eventually sail the Aegean and the Adriatic, proving that good ideas have a way of catching on, especially when they're buoyed by necessity and a bit of ingenuity. Fast forward a few centuries, and you find echoes of Egyptian maritime prowess in the very DNA of naval architecture. Take the Phoenicians, for example, those ancient seafaring rock stars who turned the Mediterranean into their personal trading post. While they were busy inventing the alphabet and spreading it across the known world, they were also building ships that owed a nod to Egyptian designs. The Phoenicians' galleys, with their distinct long hulls and central masts, were like the sports cars of antiquity, slicing through waves with a speed and grace their Egyptian predecessors could only dream of. Yet, there was a shared lineage there, a whisper of the Nile in every stroke of the oar. And then there's the myth of Egyptian naval grandiosity. Oh, it's tempting to imagine fleets as vast as the sands of the Sahara, each ship a floating palace festooned with gold. But let's reel that fantasy back in. Most Egyptian ships were about as grand as a minivan, sturdy and reliable, but lacking in the glitz department. While they were undeniably crucial in military exploits and trade, these vessels were more about practicality than pomp. They didn't cross oceans, they plied riverbanks and hugged coastlines. They were the workhorses of the water, not the show ponies. Still, their legacy sailed forward, particularly in the way these ships were a testament to human resourcefulness. Egyptian sailors, with their wooden planks and papyrus ropes, were the Mac Jivers of the ancient world, crafting solutions out of necessity. It's this spirit of innovation that resonates through history, a reminder that sometimes the best ideas are born from constraints rather than excess. Speaking of excess, let's debunk another myth, the notion that Egyptian maritime dominance was unchallenged. While the Nile was indeed the lifeline of Egypt, it was also a hotspot of geopolitical tension. Neighboring powers, from the Nubians to the Hyksos, were never far from eyeing Egypt's watery highways with envy. The idea of a monolithic Egyptian naval supremacy is as much a mirage as the oases dotting the Sahara. The truth was a patchwork of alliances and rivalries, each one testing Egypt's naval mettle in its own way. Despite these challenges, the Egyptians left behind a treasure trove of nautical wisdom. Their understanding of wind patterns, their ability to read the river's moods, and their innovation in shipbuilding all contributed to a rich tapestry of maritime lore. These weren't just sailors. They were custodians of a tradition that would inspire generations. Now, let's consider the enduring fascination with these riverine exploits. Why does the image of an Egyptian ship, its sail billowing in the breeze, captivate us so? Perhaps it's the romance of the unknown, the allure of a civilization that was as mysterious as it was mighty. Or maybe it's the sheer audacity of it all, a testament to human ambition in the face of nature's relentless challenges. After all, what's more compelling than a story of perseverance against the odds? In the end, the story of ancient Egyptian sailing is one of paradoxes, of grandeur and grit, of myths and realities. It's a tale that reminds us that even the most advanced civilization of its time was built on the same foundations we recognize today: innovation, adaptability, and the eternal human quest to explore and conquer the world around us. So, as the last light fades and the Nile slips into darkness, take a moment to reflect on this legacy. It's a reminder that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a complex, interwoven narrative of human endeavor. And just like the boats that once sailed its waters, the story of the Nile continues to flow, carrying with it the dreams and ambitions of a civilization that knew how to make waves. And with that, dear friend, we've reached our dock. Thank you for sailing with me through history's currents, where each twist and turn revealed not just the past, but insights into our own journey through time. Until next time, keep your sails high and your spirits higher. As the first rays of sun claw their way over the horizon, you're yanked from sleep by the merciless clatter of a tin roof expanding in the heat. Welcome to your day in the Wild West, circa 1880, where the rooster is your alarm clock and there's no hitting snooze. You stumble out of bed, more wooden board than mattress, and brace yourself for the chill. No central heating here, my friend. It's just you, a threadbare quilt, and the drafty walls of your settler's shack. Your morning starts with a splash of icy water from the communal basin. Yeah, indoor plumbing is a 20th century luxury you can only dream about. Washing up is a brisk, slapdash affair, more about waking up than getting clean. And speaking of dreams, forget the romanticized breakfasts you've seen on the silver screen. In reality, your morning meal is likely a bleak affair. Hardtack, that teeth-shattering biscuit, and a side of beans if you're lucky. Maybe some coffee, but don't expect it to be anything like your local barista's brew. It's more akin to mud, brewed over a campfire, and as bitter as your morning mood. Let's talk about the real cost of living. You might think $1,880 don't sound like much, but your wallet's gonna feel the burn. Consider this. Butter is a luxury at 50 cents a pound. That's about $13 today, adjusted for inflation. And if you're eyeing a new pair of boots, prepare to part with around $5. Doesn't sound too bad. Well, chew on this. Most folks are making a mere $30 a month. That's right. A single pair of boots is nearly a sixth of your monthly income. Better hope they last, or you'll be hoofing it barefoot. Your day promises a hard grind, a reality far removed from the Hollywood cowboy lifestyle. These rugged men weren't waking up to steak and eggs. More often, it was the monotonous chew of jerky, or whatever provisions hadn't spoiled. And those stories of cowboy camaraderie around the campfire, sure they happened, but so did brutal isolation and endless miles of cattle drives. The myth of the Wild West is all gunslingers and frontier justice, but the reality is a bit more mundane and a whole lot colder. Your home is a rough-hewn cabin, drafty at best, with none of the modern trappings you might take for granted. No electricity, no running water, and certainly no insulation. If you're lucky, you'll have a fireplace, but that's only as good as the wood you've chopped. Speaking of wood, your to-do list is a mile long, and it's not getting any shorter. Chores are the backbone of your existence, from collecting firewood to tending livestock or working the fields. And let's not forget the never-ending task of fetching water from the nearest well or stream. You'll need every drop for cooking, cleaning, and the occasional, if not obligatory, bath. But let's not romanticize the notion of living off the land. It's less about freedom and more about sheer survival. You're at the mercy of the elements, and every day is a gamble with nature. Drought, blizzards, or a simple lack of resources could spell disaster. A busted wagon wheel could leave you stranded miles from civilization, adding to the already daunting struggle of frontier life. Even in this world of hardship, community is everything. You rely on your neighbors like lifelines. Whether it's borrowing a tool or banding together for barn raising, there's a sense of camaraderie that's as essential as food and water. Of course, those neighbors might be miles away, and you'll have to navigate a landscape that's as unforgiving as it is vast. The Wild West wasn't just a place. It was a state of mind, a relentless pursuit of something better, even if it meant enduring hardship and uncertainty. So while you might not last a day here, the settlers who did were driven by a mix of hope, desperation, and sheer grit. They didn't have the luxury of choice. only the necessity of survival. As you step into boots that pinch with each step, you're one with the dust and grit of the frontier. The air smells of sagebrush and the promise of a long, unforgiving day. Giddy up, partner, because the Wild West waits for no one. The sun's barely up, but you're already squinting into the dusty streets of a frontier settlement, where tumbleweeds probably roll just because they know it looks cool. In the movies, this is where you'd expect gunfights at high noon, but let's be real. Most folks are too busy trying to avoid dysentery to be dueling in the streets. Hollywood's Wild West is all shootouts and sheriffs, but the actual West was more about dodging disease than dodging bullets. Disease, my friend, was the real gunslinger. Think about it. No running water means germs are having a party. Typhoid, cholera, diphtheria. These were the true outlaws, and they didn't care if you were wearing a sheriff's badge or a bandit's bandana. The lack of sanitation turned towns into petri dishes, with outhouses doubling as public health hazards and water supplies questionable at best. It's a wonder anyone survived long enough to even worry about outlaws. Speaking of sanitation, let's talk privies, or the lack thereof. Public urinals were a luxury unheard of, and the nearest facilities might be a hole in the ground. Any rainstorm turned streets into a mucky mess of questionable liquids. This was no place for the faint-hearted or those with a keen sense of smell. Now, your stroll through town reveals a bustling microcosm of humanity, each person chasing that elusive gold rush dream. Boomtowns could spring up faster than a prospector's claim, promising wealth beyond measure. Take San Francisco, where the population ballooned from 1,000 to 25,000 in just a year once word of gold got out. But with rapid growth came some serious growing pains. The economy of these towns was as volatile as a stick of dynamite. A single strike could elevate a miner to riches, while a dry vein could send them packing faster than you can say, pan for gold. Money flowed like water, or whiskey, more accurately. Saloons were the social hub, where fortunes were wagered and lost over dubious poker hands. And don't get me started on the price of a drink. A glass of whiskey could set you back a whole day's wages. But in a place where the future was as uncertain as the next sunrise, sometimes a stiff drink was all you could afford. While you're navigating the chaos of commerce, spare a thought for the social dynamics at play. This wasn't a man's world alone. Women carved out roles that were as vital as they were varied. Sure, some were saloon girls and madams, but others were business owners, teachers and nurses. Take the story of Mary Ellen Pleasant, a savvy businesswoman who used her fortune to fight for civil rights. Women here were far more than the damsels in distress of dime novels. They were the backbone and sometimes the brains behind the operation. And let's not forget the immigrants, who added their own threads to the tapestry of frontier life. Chinese laborers, lured by the promise of gold, faced immense prejudice, yet played crucial roles in building railroads and developing agriculture. Their contributions were as indispensable as they were overlooked, a hidden engine powering the West's expansion. As the sun hits its zenith, the streets buzz with a mix of languages and dialects, each voice adding to the cacophony of opportunity and survival. But remember, with diversity came tension. Frontier justice wasn't some poetic enactment of law and order. It was often arbitrary and brutal. Lynch mobs operated with a chilling efficiency, and a jury of your peers might be more interested in a quick hanging than a fair trial. In a place where the law was often as fluid as the riverbeds, justice was a gamble with stakes higher than any poker game. So here you are, in the midst of a town teetering on the edge of chaos, where the scales of fortune and fairness are as unpredictable as a frontier thunderstorm. The Wild West was not just a backdrop for tales of adventure and bravery. It was a stage where the actors were real, their stories raw and unvarnished. A place where every sunrise was an uncertain promise, and every person a story waiting to be told. And yet, there's a strange allure to it all, isn't there? The romance of the unknown, the thrill of possibility, and the silent promise that tomorrow might just be the day your luck turns. Even as you navigate these dusty streets, you're not just stepping through history. You're walking through a living, breathing paradox of myth and reality. But hold your horses, because this wild journey is just getting started. The West wasn't won in a day, and you've still got miles to go before you rest. As the midday sun blazes down like an overly enthusiastic stage light, you find yourself in the heart of Wild West mythos, the showdown. Now, Before your mind conjures up visions of high-noon duels with dust swirling dramatically, let's pump the brakes and talk about the reality of lawmen and outlaws. First off, the idea that every street was a backdrop for gunfights is about as accurate as a blindfolded marksman. The truth, most folks were too busy clinging to their hard-earned cash or their lives to engage in shootouts. Lawmen, like the famed Wyatt Earp, were more often peacekeepers than vigilantes. Earp, a name synonymous with frontier justice, actually spent more time enforcing ordinances like no guns in town than engaging in Hollywood-style standoffs. He was a gambler, a saloon keeper, and yes, a lawman, but his role was more complex than the black and white hats of cinema. He was involved in the infamous gunfight at the O.K. Corral, sure, but that 5-minute frenzy in 1881 wasn't exactly the norm. And what about those outlaws? Take Billy the Kid, a name that's become a byword for youthful rebellion and banditry. He was indeed a notorious figure, but the legend outstrips the truth. Born Henry McCarty, Billy was more a product of circumstance than a natural-born killer. He was purportedly involved in 21 murders, but historians peg the number closer to 9. Still a hefty rap sheet, but not quite the bloodbath legend suggests. Law enforcement in the Wild West had a unique flavor. Sheriffs often doubled as bartenders, not because they were moonlighting for fun, but because it was a necessary economic reality. A sheriff's salary might run a paltry $100 a month, forcing many to take on extra work to make ends meet. The lines between law and leisure blurred more often than not, with lawmen rubbing elbows with the very gamblers and drunks they might arrest. It was a world where your local sheriff could just as easily be pouring your whiskey as he could be confiscating your Colt. Ah, the Colt revolver, the iconic tool of the trade. The Colt single-action army revolver, affectionately known as the Peacemaker, was introduced in 1873 and became the quintessential sidearm of those who could afford it. But here's a curveball. It was more likely to jam than to save your skin. Precision engineering wasn't exactly a hallmark of mass production back then, and a poorly maintained revolver could misfire at a crucial moment. It wasn't the omnipotent weapon of legend. It was a tool that needed care and respect, much like a high-strung horse. And speaking of horses, let's not forget the economic realities. A decent horse could cost anywhere from $10 to $50, a significant investment considering the average monthly wage. In this world, your steed was as vital as your firearm, if not more so. Lose your horse, and you might as well lose your livelihood. While we're busting myths, let's tackle the economics of crime. The Wild West wasn't just a free-for-all for bandits looking to make a quick buck. Robbing a stagecoach might net a couple of $100, but the risks were enormous. Law enforcement, despite its flaws, was relentless. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, a private security guard and detective agency, was often employed to track down outlaws, adding an extra layer of danger to the criminal life. The Wild West was a stage where the line between hero and villain was as thin as the paper on which wanted posters were printed. The pursuit of justice, or whatever passed for it, was often a chaotic dance. Vigilante justice was rampant, and lynch mobs could form faster than a posse. The justice system was as unpredictable as the desert weather, with trials often being little more than a formality before a hanging. So here you stand, surrounded by a cast of characters as colorful as they are complicated. The lawmen and outlaws of the West were products of their environment, shaped by the relentless push of progress and the harsh realities of frontier life. They weren't mere caricatures of good and evil, but complex individuals navigating a world where survival often meant skirting the edges of legality. And yet, despite the grit and grime, there's an undeniable allure to this world. It's the romance of possibility, the promise of redemption, and the thrill of a life lived on the edge. The Wild West was a place where legends were born, not in the blaze of gunfire, but in the quiet moments of courage and the relentless pursuit of something better. So saddle up, partner. The sun's still high, and the road ahead is long. You've got a front-row seat to history, and the show is far from over. The West wasn't built in a day, and its stories are as endless as the horizon. As the sun casts long shadows over the dusty plains, you find yourself contemplating the Wild West's greatest paradox. It was a place of boundless horizons, but often felt like a prison of isolation. Imagine being hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, with only the howling wind for company. But don't get too comfortable in that reverie, because out here, travel and communication were as challenging as a high-stakes poker game with a busted flush. Let's start with the Pony Express, that legendary mail service that galloped its way into the annals of American folklore. It conjures images of dashing young riders, braving the elements and hostile territories to deliver messages across the sprawling frontier. And while it sounds like a rock-solid gig for any adrenaline junkie, the reality was as fleeting as the service itself. The Pony Express lasted a measly 18 months, from April 1860 to October 1861. Why so short-lived, you ask? Well, the telegraph saw to that, wiring its way into American life with the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. Still, the Pony Express was no small feat. Riders covered about 900 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, in around 10 days, faster than you can binge a season of your favorite show. Wasn't cheap either. Sending a half-ounce letter cost $5 back then, equivalent to about $160 today. That's a steep price to pay for a "Hey, how are you?" from dear old Aunt Edna. But speed was the name of the game, and these equestrian couriers delivered, rain or shine, risking life and limb for a paycheck of $25 a week, considerably more than the average wage of the time. Now, if you thought stagecoach travel was an upgrade, buckle up. These wooden behemoths were the Greyhound buses of their day, minus the air conditioning and suspension. Riding the stagecoach was less about relaxation and more about survival. The journey from Missouri to California could set you back a cool $200, roughly $500 today. For that price, you'd share a cramped cabin with strangers, endure bone-jarring roads, and pray the horses didn't spook at the sight of bandits or a wayward tumbleweed. Meals weren't included, and noble as it sounds to be roughing it, the reality was a diet that made hardtack look gourmet. And then there were the dangers. Bandits had a knack for targeting these wheeled treasure chests, drawn by the promise of valuables and cash. If that wasn't enough, stagecoaches were prone to breakdowns, and drivers often navigated treacherous terrain with a devil-may-care attitude. Let's just say, if you made it to your destination with your spine intact, you were doing something right. As for communication, the telegraph was a game-changer, bringing the Wild West into the 19th century faster than a sneeze in a dust storm. Suddenly, the latest news from the East Coast wasn't weeks old by the time it reached the frontier. It was yesterday's headline. By 1861, the first transcontinental telegraph line was completed, connecting the coasts and rendering the Pony Express obsolete. Messages that once took days now traveled in minutes, a feat as miraculous as finding water in the desert. But like everything in the West, this progress came with complications. The telegraph needed constant maintenance and protection, not just from the elements, but from those who saw it as a symbol of encroaching civilization. Native American tribes, already under pressure from westward expansion, sometimes cut lines or attacked stations in resistance. Railroads, too, changed the landscape, threading iron veins across the continent and ushering in a new era of mobility and commerce. They connected towns, fueled economies, and made cross-country travel accessible, if not comfortable. Yet, with these advances came new challenges. Railroads disrupted traditional ways of life, and towns once bustling with stagecoach traffic saw their importance diminish overnight. The lone rider, that romantic figure of lone wanderer, was less a reality and more a relic of a rapidly changing world. Journeys became less about solitude and more about navigating a web of tracks and wires that promised connection but also complexity. The harsh reality. The Wild West was a place where the price of progress was often paid in blood, sweat, and tears. It was a land of opportunity, sure, but one where each step forward carried the weight of countless struggles and sacrifices. The telegraph and railroads might have shrunk distances, but they couldn't erase the challenges of life on the frontier. So as the sun dips below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the rugged landscape, you're left to ponder the relentless march of time and technology. The Wild West wasn't just a backdrop for tales of grit and glory. It was a crucible where dreams were forged and futures decided. And while we've only scratched the surface of its complexities, one thing is clear. The legends were just the beginning. There's more to this story than meets the eye, and the journey is far from over. Ah, but as the night descends over the dusty towns of the Wild West, it's time to swap the grit of daylight for the glow of lamplight. Welcome to the after hours, where saloons reign supreme as the bustling social hubs, not just watering holes for parched cowboys. Imagine the scene, a cacophony of laughter, the clink of glasses, and the unmistakable hum of a piano fighting valiantly against out-of-tune voices. If the daytime was about survival, the nighttime was about forgetting, even if just for a moment. Saloons were the beating heart of frontier towns, serving up not just drinks, but also a heady mix of entertainment and escapism. The economics of these establishments were as intricate as a poker hand. A glass of whiskey could set you back 25 cents, about $7 today. Given that a cowboy might earn $30 a month, that's a pretty stiff drink, literally and figuratively. But hey, when you're living life on the edge, a shot of liquid courage might just be worth a day's wage. Poker was the game of choice, where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a card. In 1876, Wild Bill Hickok, a legendary gunslinger, famously met his end during a poker game in Deadwood, holding what would become known as the dead man's hand, aces and eights. The stakes were high, not just in cash but in reputation. And let's not forget the vaudeville shows, a potpourri of music, comedy, and variety acts that kept audiences entertained. Tickets might cost 50 cents, a small fortune at the time, but for many it was a price worth paying to escape the monotony of frontier life. Yet, while saloons offered a veneer of revelry, they also harbored a darker underbelly of vice and violence. Brawls were as common as barflies, and the local sheriff often doubled as a bouncer, trying to maintain some semblance of order. Crime was a constant companion, lurking in the shadows cast by flickering oil lamps. Justice was swift and brutal, often bypassing the courtroom for the gallows. Trials were sometimes little more than formality, a nod to due process before the inevitable sentence was carried out. Vigilante justice was the order of the day, with lynch mobs forming faster than you could say due process. In 1882, the infamous Jesse James met his end, not in a blaze of glory, but by a bullet to the back of the head from a member of his own gang, seeking a bounty. It's a stark reminder that in the Wild West, betrayal was often the cost of doing business. As we reflect on the enduring myths of this era, it's clear why they persist. There's a romantic allure to the idea of the lone cowboy, the untamed frontier, and the notion of carving out a life against the odds. Hollywood has spun these tales into cinematic gold, but the truth is far grittier. The Wild West was a crucible of chaos and opportunity, where life was as unpredictable as the weather. So why do these myths endure? Perhaps it's because they speak to something fundamentally human, a longing for adventure, a thirst for freedom, and the hope that we, too, could forge a new path in an unforgiving world. The Wild West captures our imagination because it represents the ultimate gamble, where every sunrise offered a fresh start, and every sunset, a moment to reflect on the day's wins and losses. In the end, the legends of the Wild West are more than just stories. They're a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. They reveal our fascination with the edge of civilization, where the rules were unwritten and the stakes were life and death. It's a world that, despite its hardships, promises something timeless, the chance to redefine what it means to be free. So as you lay your weary head down, snug in your modern comforts, spare a thought for those who braved the wilds before us. Their stories, both real and imagined, continue to shape our understanding of the past and our dreams for the future. The Wild West wasn't just a place, it was a state of mind, a relentless pursuit of possibility in the face of adversity. And while you might not last a day there, the spirit of the West endures, a reminder that even in the harshest of landscapes, hope is a powerful force. The Gilded Age in America was a time when opulence wasn't just a lifestyle, it was practically a competitive sport. Think of it as the Instagram era, but with way more corsets and even fewer scruples. Born into this era of extravagance was Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose life was less about champagne wishes and caviar dreams and more about being a pawn on the chessboard of high society. Raised with every conceivable luxury, Consuelo's childhood was like living inside a Fabergé egg, glittering on the outside but surprisingly hollow within. Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, was a magnate of the railroad industry, and her mother, Alva, was the kind of social climber who would have given Spider-Man a run for his money. The Vanderbilt fortune was substantial, ballooning to a worth of over $200 million by the late 19th century, thanks to the family's savvy, or ruthless, depending on your perspective, business strategies. But this wasn't just old money reclining in a leather club chair. It was new money, eager to prove itself against the old guard of New York's elite. Alva Vanderbilt was notorious for her relentless ambition. She wasn't just building a family, she was constructing a dynasty. This wasn't your typical mom in the stands at soccer games kind of drive. This was more like Game of Thrones meets Downton Abbey, with Alva playing both queen and kingmaker. The family home was the Breakers, a so-called summer cottage in Newport, Rhode Island. And by cottage, I mean a 70-room Italian Renaissance-style palace that cost a cool $10 million to build, a sum that could have bought quite a few actual cottages. Now, you might think growing up in such lavish surroundings would be every child's dream. But for Consuelo, it was more like a posh boot camp. Her days were filled with a rigorous schedule of etiquette lessons, language training, and the kind of social duties that would make even the most seasoned diplomat break a sweat. Forget hopscotch. Consuelo was learning the subtle art of fan-flirting and the intricacies of curtsying without toppling over. Her childhood was less about playdates and more about preparing to be the perfect, polished societal ornament. In the broader context, the Gilded Age was a period marked by rapid industrial growth, which was often accompanied by a staggering increase in wealth for a select few. While the Vanderbilts were busy building their empire, the average American was dealing with the less glamorous side of industrialization. Grueling work hours, low wages, and increasingly crowded cities. It was a time of stark contrasts, where the gap between the rich and the poor was as wide as the gap between Consuelo's drawing room and the servants' quarters. Consuelo's mother, Alva, was determined to break into the upper echelons of society, which was no small feat. The social register was as tightly closed as a miser's wallet. Alva's solution: a 10,000 square-foot mansion on Fifth Avenue, complete with a ballroom that could rival Versailles. She hosted a costume ball so extravagant that even Marie Antoinette might have raised an eyebrow. It was an event that reportedly cost $250,000, the equivalent of several $1 million today, and it was all designed to announce the Vanderbilts as a family to be reckoned with. Consuelo's life was dictated by these grand designs, a pawn in a game where the stakes were social prestige and familial advancement. While she was paraded around as the epitome of grace and decorum, the reality was that her life was as heavily curated as any modern influencer's Instagram feed. Her upbringing was not just about preserving wealth, but using it as a tool to maneuver through the intricate labyrinth of social standings. Consuelo's education was a patchwork of tutors and governesses, each teaching her the finer points of European languages, history, and, of course, the art of being seen but not heard. The end game for all this grooming was clear: marriage. But not just any marriage, a union that would further the Vanderbilt name and fortune. Her mother had a vision, and it involved transatlantic matchmaking, a practice that was all the rage among America's elite. Why settle for a mere millionaire when you could snag a duke? In this era, love was often a luxury that came second to titles and estates. For Consuelo, her mother's ambitions meant her heart's desires were as negotiable as a railroad contract. The Gilded Age, with all its glitter and grandeur, was not particularly forgiving to those who deviated from their prescribed roles. Consuelo's childhood, though gilded, was a testament to a life lived in service of the family name, where personal happiness was often sacrificed at the altar of social ambition. But let's not get too wrapped up in the idea that this was just a story of one girl's gilded cage. The broader picture reveals a society in flux, where the rules of engagement were being written by the likes of J.P. Morgan and Andrew Carnegie. Industrial titans were shaping not just the economy, but also the social landscape, turning their fortunes into power and influence. Consuelo Vanderbilt was a product of her time, a symbol of the wealth and excess that defined an era even as it teetered on the brink of change. As Consuelo grew, so did the expectations placed upon her. The weight of her family's ambitions was as unyielding as the steel rails that had built their empire. From the outside, her life may have seemed like a fairy tale, but beneath the surface, it was a carefully orchestrated performance. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt is not just about one woman's journey through the Gilded Age. It's a window into the contradictions and complexities of an era where appearances were everything, and reality often took a back seat to the grand illusion. And so, Consuelo Vanderbilt, groomed for grandeur like a prize rose at a county fair, was about to be plucked for an altogether different kind of bouquet, the kind that came with a title, an estate, and a distinctly British accent. Enter the Dollar Princess era, a peculiarly transatlantic phenomenon where American heiresses, flush with cash but low on aristocratic clout, found themselves in high demand among Europe's nobility, who were rich in titles, but often cash-poor to the point of embarrassment. Consuelo was set to become a headline act in this peculiar dance of dollars and dynasties. Her mother, Alva, saw to it that her daughter's hand, and the substantial Vanderbilt fortune that came with it, would fit snugly into the glove of British aristocracy. In 1895, Consuelo was married off to Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Now, here's where it gets juicy. The dowry. A staggering dollar, too. 5 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's the kind of cash you'd need a wheelbarrow to cart around. Roughly $80 million today. And just like that, the wheels of this high society transaction were greased more liberally than politicians' palms during election season. But let's not pretend this was a love story for the ages. The union was less about Cupid's arrows and more about financial spreadsheets. Charles Spencer Churchill, while carrying a title that could make any social climber's pulse race, was strapped for cash. His ancestral home, Blenheim Palace, was an architectural marvel in the Oxfordshire countryside with upkeep costs that could rival those of a small nation. Enter Consuelo and her dowry, a financial lifeline that promised to keep the Marlborough estates from crumbling into quaint ruins. Consuelo, meanwhile, was the proverbial lamb led to the slaughter, or in this case, the altar. Her marriage was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign, with her mother Alva as the 5-star general. Love and personal preference were about as relevant as a third wheel on a bicycle. Consuelo reportedly wept behind her wedding veil, a fact that didn't quite fit the fairy tale narrative they were selling to the public. Yet, in the world of Gilded Age social politics, her tears were mere collateral damage in the quest for status. The Dollar Princess marriages were the perfect storm of economic desperation and social ambition. American heiresses brought the cash, and European nobles brought the cachet. It was a win-win, or so it seemed from the outside looking in. The reality was often far more complex and infinitely less romantic. These marriages were less about happily ever after and more about financially stable for now. Consuelo's story is a prime example of how these transatlantic alliances were really just elaborate business deals in the guise of matrimonial bliss. Her arranged marriage wasn't unique. It was emblematic of a broader trend during the Gilded Age, where social climbing was practically an Olympic sport. American families, particularly those with newer fortunes like the Vanderbilts, craved the legitimacy that a European title could bestow. It was like buying a brand name to slap on their carefully curated social lives. Charles Spencer Churchill, for his part, wasn't exactly thrilled about the arrangement either. He was said to have had his sights set on another woman, but in the end, practicality triumphed over passion. His motivation was as clear as day: maintain the family's aristocratic legacy while avoiding bankruptcy. Blenheim Palace, with its staggering 187 rooms, was both a blessing and a financial curse, a monument to the family's history that came with a modern-day price tag. In an age where appearances were everything, these Dollar Princess marriages preserved the facade of nobility while quietly acknowledging the economic realities beneath. The absurdity of it all is almost Shakespearean, if Shakespeare had written with a ledger in hand. The marriages produced headlines, whispered gossip, and occasionally genuine alliances. But more often than not, they were a masterclass in compromise. Consuelo's marriage to the Duke of Marlborough was a transaction masquerading as a romance, a tale not of love but of logistics. Her dowry was the golden ticket that kept Blenheim afloat, much like a financial life raft thrown to a sinking ship. It's a story that debunks the myths of romanticized aristocracy, revealing instead a harsh reality where wealth and status were commodities to be traded. As we sift through the glitter and the grit of Consuelo's story, it's essential to remember that these marriages were a product of their time. a time when economic motivations were as influential as any grand romantic gesture. The Dollar Princess era was a curious blend of Old World titles and New World wealth, a period that perfectly encapsulated the contradictions and complexities of the Gilded Age. Consuelo's life was a reflection of a world in transition, where the old guard of European nobility was reluctantly embracing the brash, new money of American industry. Her arranged marriage was less a fairy tale and more a cautionary tale, a vivid illustration of the lengths to which families would go to secure their place in a rapidly changing society. And so, Consuelo Vanderbilt became a duchess, not through love, but through the cold calculus of social ambition. Her story is a reminder that beneath the glamour and glitz of the Gilded Age, there existed a world of hard-nosed pragmatism and strategic alliances, where personal happiness was often a secondary concern to the pursuit of power and prestige. So, Consuelo Vanderbilt may have entered her marriage with a tiara and a title, but what she found at Blenheim Palace was a life that felt less like a fairy tale and more like a gilded cage with a particularly drafty moat. While the public imagined her living in the lap of luxury, the reality was that her marriage was as frosty as a British winter. The Duke, Charles Spencer Churchill, wasn't exactly Prince Charming. He was more like Prince Chill, a man whose heart was as cold as the stone walls of their estate. The cultural clash between American optimism and British stoicism didn't make things any easier. Consuelo, with her New World effervescence, found herself in the midst of Old World rigidity. Blenheim Palace was a sprawling estate with 187 rooms, each one echoing with the ghostly memories of past grandeur. It was a place where tradition reigned supreme, and change was as welcome as a bull in a china shop. Imagine being told that your American enthusiasm was about as welcome as a heatwave in December. Consuelo struggled to find her place in this labyrinth of formality and frost. Her marriage, like so many of the era, was a union of convenience rather than affection. The couple led largely separate lives within the palace, a fact that was as obvious as the absurdity of wearing white gloves at breakfast. The Duke was more interested in maintaining the family's aristocratic facade than in cultivating a loving relationship. He was often preoccupied with estate matters and hunting expeditions, leaving Consuelo to her own devices. And what did Consuelo do with her newfound solitude? Well, she turned her focus outward. Unlike the Duke, her interests extended beyond the confines of their estate. She became increasingly involved in social causes, much to the chagrin of her husband, who likely viewed philanthropy as a quaint American eccentricity. Consuelo's passion for social reform was sparked by the stark contrast between the opulence of her surroundings and the dire poverty she witnessed during her travels in the slums of London. Consuelo's interest in social causes was a bold move in a time when women of her standing were expected to do little more than host tea parties and produce heirs. She championed causes like housing reform and women's rights, using her position to spotlight issues that she believed were of far greater importance than the latest ball or garden party. Her commitment to philanthropy was as genuine as it was groundbreaking, particularly in an era where the elite preferred to keep their pearls and their problems well hidden behind closed doors. The Duke, on the other hand, was less than thrilled by Consuelo's activism. He had little interest in the social issues of the day, preferring to focus his energies on preserving the family legacy, which, let's be honest, was more about maintaining appearances than addressing any deeper societal concerns. The couple's priorities were as out of sync as a broken metronome, with Consuelo pushing for change and the Duke clinging to the past. Their separate lives within Blenheim Palace became a well-known secret among their circle. The estate, while a testament to architectural grandeur, was also a stark reminder of their emotional distance. Consuelo often found solace in the vast gardens and long walks, while the Duke occupied himself with estate affairs and the occasional shooting party. It was a marriage of parallel paths that seldom intersected, a union more in name than in spirit. Despite the chilly atmosphere, Consuelo's determination to make a difference in the world was unshakable. Her efforts were not just a personal rebellion against her prescribed role, but a genuine desire to effect change. She once famously said, "I would rather be a rebel than a slave," a sentiment that resonated both in her personal life and her public endeavors. Her activism was a testament to her resilience, a way to carve out an identity that was separate from her title and her husband. Consuelo's story highlights the stark reality behind the romanticized image of aristocratic life. While the world may have seen her as a duchess living in a palace, the truth was far more complex. Her marriage was a transaction, her home a monument to a legacy that was as much a burden as it was a blessing. Yet, through it all, Consuelo managed to find her own voice, using her position to advocate for those less fortunate, a legacy far more enduring than any title. As we dig deeper into Consuelo's life, the myth of the happily ever after unravels to reveal a woman who, despite her circumstances, refused to be defined by them. Her journey was one of self-discovery and defiance, a reminder that even within the confines of a gilded age, the human spirit can find a way to shine through. And while her marriage may not have been the love story that fairy tales are made of, it was a story of resilience and resolve, a tale of a woman who, despite everything, found a way to make her mark on the world. And so, despite the grandeur of Blenheim Palace, Consuelo Vanderbilt found herself trapped in a life that felt more like an elaborate chess game where she was just another pawn. But here's where the story takes a turn worthy of a plot twist in your favorite binge-worthy drama. By 1921, Consuelo had had enough of playing the dutiful duchess. She did the unthinkable for a woman of her standing and time. She filed for divorce from Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. Now, divorce in the 1920s, especially for someone of Consuelo's stature, was like wearing socks with sandals, socially unacceptable and sure to raise eyebrows. But for Consuelo, it wasn't just about escaping a loveless marriage. It was about reclaiming her life. She wasn't just breaking marital bonds. She was shattering the constraints of societal expectations. Imagine the gasps echoing through the halls of aristocracy like a scandalous game of telephone. Financially, the divorce was as complex as a Rubik's Cube. The settlement terms were no small potatoes. Consuelo was awarded a handsome sum, including an allowance that would be the envy of any socialite. But let's not sugarcoat it. This was more of a strategic retreat than a financial windfall. The settlement ensured her comfort, but wasn't enough to turn back time or erase the years of emotional frostbite. Socially, the repercussions were akin to a game of dominoes. One move set off a series of reactions. The aristocracy, with its stiff upper lip, viewed divorce as an act of rebellion on par with wearing white after Labor Day. But for Consuelo, it was liberation. She was no longer bound by the rigid protocols of British nobility or the suffocating expectations of her birthright. Finally, she could be more than just a duchess. She could be herself. And speaking of new beginnings, Consuelo didn't waste time reinventing her story. Enter Jacques Bolson, a man as intriguing as his title, a French aviator with a penchant for adventure and a knack for charming heiresses. Jacques wasn't just any flyboy. He was a pioneer in aviation, a field that was as daring and unpredictable as the stock market. Consuelo and Jacques married in 1921, and it was as if she traded the cold corridors of Blenheim for the open skies of possibility. This second marriage was a different kind of affair, a refreshing cocktail of mutual respect and shared interests, rather than the watered-down business arrangement she had with the Duke. Jacques Bolson was the kind of man who saw Consuelo not just as a title or a means to an end, but as a partner. With him, she found a freedom that had eluded her within the walls of Blenheim, a chance to soar beyond the limitations of her previous life. Now, let's pause to debunk a stubborn myth. Many romanticize Consuelo's post-divorce life as a fairy tale ending, a narrative of redemption and romance. But reality, as always, was more nuanced. Sure, she found happiness with Jacques, but she also faced the ongoing challenge of redefining her identity in a world that preferred its women to remain neatly boxed within their roles. Consuelo's story wasn't a neat arc. It was a series of zigzags that reflected the complexities of her time. Despite these challenges, Consuelo's influence in social reform movements only grew. She became an ardent supporter of women's rights, using her voice to champion causes that had long been ignored by the elite. Her advocacy work was as vibrant as a Picasso painting, full of bold strokes and daring colors. Consuelo wasn't just a figurehead. She was a force, pushing for change in an era that often resisted it. Consuelo's life post-divorce wasn't just about personal freedom. It was about using her newfound autonomy to make a difference. She was instrumental in several social reform efforts, from advocating for better housing conditions to supporting the suffrage movement. Her work was a testament to the fact that true influence doesn't come from titles or wealth, but from the courage to stand up and be counted. In a world that often reduced her to a mere footnote in the annals of aristocratic history, Consuelo Vanderbilt carved out a narrative that was entirely her own. Her story challenges us to look beyond the glittering facade of the Gilded Age and see the grit and determination that lay beneath. She was more than a duchess or a divorcee. She was a trailblazer, proving that even in the most gilded of cages, there is always room for flight. As we delve further into Consuelo's journey, it's clear that her life was not defined by the titles she held or the estates she graced, but by her indomitable spirit and her commitment to social change. Her story is a reminder that even amidst the most rigid structures, there is always a chance to break free and redefine one's destiny. Stay tuned, because Consuelo's journey is far from over. The divorce was just the beginning of a new chapter, and there's more to uncover about her life as a social reformer, a wife, and an unyielding spirit in a world that often demanded submission. We'll see how Consuelo continued to defy expectations and leave an indelible mark on history, proving that even the most unlikely heiress can become a heroine in her own right. So, as Consuelo Vanderbilt stepped into this new chapter of her life, she wasn't just turning the page, she was writing a whole new book. This wasn't your typical rags-to-riches story, more like riches to rebel. Consuelo was on a mission, armed with a wealth of experience that came from living both the highs and lows of high society. Her journey from gilded cage to social crusader is the stuff of legends, but let's peel back the layers and see what's really at play here. First off, let's talk legacy. Consuelo Vanderbilt became a symbol of transformation. Her journey from a trophy wife to a trailblazer for social change challenges every romanticized notion of the Gilded Age. This was an era when women were expected to be seen and not heard, more ornamental than operational. Yet, Consuelo defied these norms with a tenacity that echoed through history. Her advocacy wasn't just about charity galas and garden parties. It was about tackling the big issues head-on. She threw herself into causes like housing reform, a topic as gritty as it was urgent. In 1919, Consuelo founded the American Friends of Blinded Soldiers and Sailors, an organization dedicated to supporting veterans who had lost their sight during the Great War. This wasn't just a passing interest or a way to pass the time between society events. Consuelo was hands-on, raising funds and awareness with the kind of fervor that could only come from someone who understood the power of privilege and the responsibility that came with it. But here's the kicker. Consuelo's impact went far beyond the causes she championed. She laid down a blueprint for future generations of women seeking autonomy and fulfillment beyond the constraints of societal expectations. The Gilded Age, for all its glitter, was a time of rigid social hierarchies. Consuelo, by contrast, was a master at navigating these networks while simultaneously challenging them. She was like a social reform ninja, stealthily dismantling the status quo while everyone else was distracted by the glitz. Now, let's not pretend this was all smooth sailing. Consuelo faced her fair share of resistance. The upper echelons of society didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for reformers, especially those who upset the apple cart of aristocratic tradition. But Consuelo was undeterred. She wielded her influence like a double-edged sword, opening doors that had long been closed to women of her time. One could argue that Consuelo's true legacy lies not in the titles she held or the estates she graced, but in the path she paved for others. She proved that even in an era that seemed tailor-made for male dominance, a woman with enough determination and moxie could forge her own destiny. This was a time when the very idea of female autonomy was as radical as suggesting that corsets be optional. Consuelo's life was a testament to the power of perseverance and the importance of standing up for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you. In her later years, Consuelo published her memoirs, aptly titled The Glitter and the Gold. It's a candid account that strips away the romantic veneer of her early life, offering instead a raw and unvarnished look at the realities of her journey. Through her words, Consuelo invites us to see beyond the fairy tale and into the heart of a woman who refused to be defined by her circumstances. Her book sold like hotcakes, a testament to the public's hunger for stories that went beyond the gilded surface. One might say Consuelo Vanderbilt was a woman ahead of her time, a trailblazer who defied the conventions of her era to create a legacy of empowerment and change. Her story isn't just about breaking free from a gilded cave. It's about soaring above it and inspiring others to do the same. She left behind a world that was just a little bit better than the one she was born into, a world where women started to see the possibilities beyond their prescribed roles. So, as you drift off to sleep, remember Consuelo not just as the duchess who dared to divorce, but as the woman who dared to redefine what it meant to be truly free. Her legacy is a reminder that even in the most glittering of ages, it's the grit and courage to pursue change that truly shine. And as you ponder her story, consider how her journey from opulent constraint to purpose-driven freedom offers a lesson that resonates far beyond the pages of history.